Understanding the situation. War is not something most of us ever expect to face. It's the kind of thing we watch on screens, read about in history books, or hear about from people in distant places. But for millions of people around the world, war is not a distant concept. It is the street outside their window. It is the sound that wakes them at 3 in the morning. It is the decision they have to make before breakfast about whether it is safe to leave the house. This video exists for those people and for anyone who wants to be prepared. Because whether you are living through an active conflict, you are a journalist working in a war zone, you are aid worker on the ground, or you are simply someone who wants to understand what survival actually looks like when the worst happens, the information in this video could save your life, or the life of someone you love. Over the course of this video, we're going to cover everything from the basics of situational awareness all the way through to long-term survival strategies. We're not going to talk about this in vague, abstract terms. We are going to be specific, practical, and honest because in a real emergency, vague advice is worthless. You need to know exactly what to do and exactly why. So, let's start at the very beginning. Before we talk about shelters, before we talk about evacuation routes, before we talk about supplies or signals or any of the practical mechanics of staying alive, we need to talk about something more fundamental. We need to talk about your mindset and your understanding of the situation you are in. Here is the first and perhaps most important thing to understand. Staying safe in a war zone is not about luck. It is about preparation, awareness, and the ability to take quick, decisive action when it matters. Those three things, preparation, awareness, and quick action, are the foundation of everything else we are going to discuss. Without them, even the best equipment and the best shelter in the world will not protect you. With them, you dramatically increase your chances of surviving situations that, on the surface, can seem completely unsurvivable. Let's break those three things down. Preparation means that you have thought through scenarios before they happen. It means you know where your nearest shelter is before you need it. It means you have a bag packed before you have to run. It means you have had a conversation with your family about what to do and where to meet before the moment arrives when you can no longer have that conversation calmly. Preparation is the work you do in the quiet moments so that when the loud moments come, you are not starting from zero. You already have a plan. You already have options. And options in a crisis are everything. Awareness means that you are paying attention to what is happening around you at all times. Not in a paranoid way, but in a grounded, deliberate way. It means you notice when the atmosphere in your neighborhood shifts. It means you recognize the difference between the sounds of everyday life and the sounds that signal something has changed. It means you are watching, listening, and thinking because the information your senses give you in real time is often the most valuable information you have. And quick action means that when you receive a signal, whether that is a warning siren, a message from someone you trust, or simply your own instinct telling you something is wrong, you move. You do not hesitate, you do not wait to see what everyone else is doing, and you do not assume that someone else will tell you when it is time. You act because in many life-threatening situations, the window of time in which action makes a difference can be measured in seconds. Now, one of the most critical tools you have for preparation and awareness is information. And in a conflict zone, information is both incredibly valuable and incredibly dangerous because not all information is equal and not all sources of information are trustworthy. This is why staying informed through official alerts and emergency broadcasts is so important. When conflict breaks out, or when it escalates, governments, civil defense agencies, and international humanitarian organizations will often issue alerts and broadcasts that contain genuinely life-saving information. These might tell you that a ceasefire corridor is opening up, giving you a window to evacuate. They might warn you that a particular area is about to be targeted and that you need to move away from it. They might tell you where water distribution is happening, or where medical help is available, or which roads are currently passable. These alerts are not perfect and they are not always timely, but they are your best anchor to verified, actionable information. So wherever you are, you need to know how those alerts reach people. Is it through a national radio station? Is it through an official government app? Is it through a local civil defense network? Find out before you need it, and make sure you have a way to receive those broadcasts, even if the power goes out. A battery-powered or hand crank radio is one of the single most valuable items you can own in a conflict zone for exactly this reason. What you want to avoid is the opposite of official, verified information, and that is rumors. In conflict situations, rumors spread faster than any official broadcast ever could. People are frightened, communication lines are disrupted, and in that environment, stories mutate and distort every time they are passed from one person to the next. A rumor that a certain route is safe might cause a crowd of people to move directly into danger. A rumor that an attack is imminent in a place where no attack is coming can cause a panic that itself becomes deadly. People trampled, people separated from their families, people making frantic decisions based on information that was never true to begin with. This does not mean you should dismiss everything you hear from people around you. Local knowledge and community networks have real value. But it does mean you should develop a habit of asking yourself, every time you receive a piece of information, where did this come from? Has it been confirmed by a second source? Does it match what official channels are saying? And if the answer to those questions is no, treat that information with caution. Do not act on it dramatically until you have something to back it up. There is another dimension to the information problem that is less obvious but just as important, and it has to do not with the quality of the information you are taking in, but with the quantity. When you are living through a conflict, the temptation is to stay constantly connected to the news, to refresh constantly, to watch every broadcast, to follow every update because it feels like the more information you have, the safer you are. And while staying informed is genuinely important, there is a point at which consuming too much information stops helping you and starts actively harming you. That point is different for everyone, but research consistently shows that excessive news consumption during crisis events leads to heightened anxiety, disrupted sleep, impaired decision-making, and a psychological state that professionals sometimes call chronic threat activation, where your nervous system is essentially stuck in high alert, unable to distinguish between information about danger and actual immediate danger. When you are in that state, you are more likely to panic, less likely to think clearly, and less capable of executing the kind of calm, deliberate action that we talked about at the beginning. This is why limiting your news intake to roughly 15 to 30 minutes per day from verified sources is genuinely sound survival advice. It might sound counterintuitive. It might even feel irresponsible. But what you are doing is protecting your cognitive function. You are keeping your mind clear enough to actually act well, rather than flooding it with a constant stream of threat information that you cannot do anything about in the moment. Choose your windows of time deliberately. Pick 1 or 2 times a day when you will check in with official sources, get the information you need, and then step back. Use the rest of your mental energy for the things that are actually within your control: your shelter, your supplies, your family, your plan. That is where your attention will do the most good. So, to bring this opening section together, the foundation of staying safe in a war zone is not any single piece of equipment or any single technique. It is a way of operating. It is the combination of being prepared before danger arrives, being genuinely aware of what is happening around you in real time, and being ready to act quickly when action is required. It is anchoring yourself to verified, official information while filtering out the noise of rumors and speculation. And it is protecting your own mental clarity by managing how much of that information you consume so that when the moment comes to make a critical decision, your mind is actually capable of making it well. Everything else we cover in this video builds on this foundation. The shelter strategies, the evacuation planning, the first aid, the communication tactics, all of it only works if you are approaching the situation with preparation, awareness, and the ability to act. So hold on to those principles as we go, because they're going to come up again and again. In the next segment, we're going to move from mindset into the physical environment and talk about how to assess your surroundings, identify threats, and make smart decisions about where to be and where not to be. Because awareness is not just a state of mind, it is also a set of concrete, learnable skills. And those skills are coming up next. Preparing before danger hits. There is a concept that military planners, emergency responders, and survival experts all come back to again and again, and it is this: the time to prepare is before you need to. It sounds almost too simple to be worth saying. But the reason professionals repeat it so often is because human beings are wired to do the opposite. We are wired to wait. We see a threat on the horizon, and we tell ourselves it probably won't reach us, or that we'll deal with it when it gets closer, or that someone else, the government, the military, a neighbor, will handle it before it becomes our problem. That instinct is understandable. It is also, in a conflict situation, potentially fatal. The window between when danger becomes real and when it arrives at your door is often much shorter than people expect. And in that window, you will not be calmly gathering supplies and making rational decisions. You will be frightened. Your hands may be shaking. The streets may already be dangerous. The shops may already be empty. The roads may already be blocked. Everything that would have taken you an hour to do in calm, quiet preparation can become impossible to do in the chaos of an actual emergency. So this segment is about closing that gap. It is about doing the work now in whatever calm you currently have so that when the storm arrives, you are not starting from zero. You already have what you need. You already know what to do. And that changes everything. Let's start with the most fundamental piece of preparation, your emergency kit. An emergency kit is exactly what it sounds like, a collection of essential supplies that you have gathered in advance and stored somewhere accessible so that if you need to shelter in place or evacuate quickly, you have what you need without having to think about it in the moment. Here is what that kit needs to contain, at a minimum. Food. Non-perishable food that requires little or no preparation. Canned goods, dried foods, energy bars, anything with a long shelf life that provides real nutritional value. You are not building a gourmet pantry here. You are building a survival buffer. Think about what your household actually needs to sustain itself, and stock accordingly. Water. This is the one people most commonly underestimate, and it is the one where underestimating can kill you fastest. The standard guidance from emergency management organizations around the world is 1 gallon of water per person per day, and you want at least a 2-week supply. Take a moment to actually do that math for your household. If you have 4 people, that is 4 gallons per day, which is 56 gallons for 2 weeks. That is a significant quantity, and it needs to be stored in clean, sealed containers in a location that is accessible but not exposed to direct sunlight or extreme temperatures. If storing that volume is not realistic in your space, then prioritize as much as you can and also invest in water purification tablets or a reliable filtration system, because in a prolonged conflict situation, the ability to make unsafe water drinkable is an extraordinarily valuable capability to have. First aid supplies. A well-stocked first aid kit needs to go beyond the basic adhesive bandages that most people think of when they hear those words. You want gauze, medical tape, antiseptic, scissors, tweezers, a thermometer, disposable gloves, and ideally materials for wound packing if you can get them and learn how to use them. In a conflict zone, access to medical professionals can disappear very quickly, and even relatively minor injuries can become life-threatening if they are not treated properly. Your first aid kit is your bridge to getting through until professional help is available. A flashlight and batteries. Power outages are among the most common and immediate consequences of conflict. Infrastructure gets hit, grids go down, and suddenly you are trying to navigate your home or your street in complete darkness. A reliable, battery-powered flashlight and enough spare batteries to keep it running for an extended period is non-negotiable. Consider also keeping a headlamp, which keeps your hands free, and candles with matches or a lighter as a backup. Identification documents and cash. This combination is critically important and surprisingly often overlooked. In an emergency, especially if you need to evacuate, you may need to prove who you are to checkpoint personnel, to aid organizations, to officials at a border crossing. Keep copies of your passport, national ID, birth certificates, medical records, insurance documents, and any other critical paperwork in a waterproof folder or bag inside your kit. And keep cash on hand, in small denominations, because in many conflict situations, electronic payment systems stop functioning. ATMs run out of money or lose power. Banks close. Cash becomes the only currency that works, and if you do not have it, your ability to move, to buy supplies, and to secure safety can be severely compromised. Hygiene items. This is another category that people tend to deprioritize until they realize how quickly the absence of basic hygiene creates serious health problems. Soap, hand sanitizer, toothbrushes and toothpaste, feminine hygiene products, toilet paper, and garbage bags should all be in your kit. In a shelter situation, poor hygiene spreads illness rapidly, and illness in a conflict zone when medical access is limited, is a much more serious threat than it would be under normal circumstances. Beyond the core kit, there are several additional items that significantly extend your ability to be self-sufficient, and self-sufficiency, the ability to look after yourself and your household without outside assistance for at least 72 hours, is a key survival goal in the early stages of any conflict escalation. Medications. If anyone in your household takes prescription medication, maintaining a supply of at least several weeks ahead of need is essential. In conflict situations, pharmacies close, supply chains break down, and getting a specific medication that someone depends on can go from being a routine errand to being nearly impossible almost overnight. Talk to your doctor now while things are calm about building a reserve. For general use, also stock pain relievers, antihistamines, antidiarrheal medication, and any other over-the-counter items your household commonly needs. Duct tape. Few items are as versatile in an emergency as duct tape. It can seal gaps around doors and windows to reduce exposure to dust, smoke, or airborne contaminants. It can make emergency repairs to damaged shelters, bags, clothing, and equipment. It can be used to create improvised stretchers, to secure bandages, to mark locations. Keep several rolls. Thermal blankets. These are the thin, foil-like emergency blankets that fold down to almost nothing but are extraordinarily effective at retaining body heat. They are cheap, they are lightweight, they take up virtually no space, and in a situation where you are sheltering somewhere cold without access to heating, they can be the difference between hypothermia and making it through the night. Keep one for every member of your household. A multi-tool. A good quality multi-tool, the kind that incorporates a knife, pliers, screwdriver, can opener, and other functions in a single compact device, is one of the highest value items you can have in an emergency kit relative to its size and weight. There are dozens of situations in a survival scenario where having these tools available matters, from opening food cans to making repairs to cutting material for improvised shelter. The goal with all of these items together is to reach a state where, if the world outside your door becomes completely inaccessible for 72 hours, you can sustain yourself and your household through that window without needing anything from outside. 72 hours is not an arbitrary number. It reflects the period that emergency management professionals identify as the most acute phase of most crisis events, and the period during which outside help is least likely to be available. If you can get through that window on your own resources, your options on the other side improve dramatically. Now let's talk about your physical environment, because your home is not just a place to store your kit. It is also, in a conflict situation, a space that you need to think about strategically. Every home has areas that are safer than others during an attack, and most people have never thought about which areas those are until they need to know. The time to think about it is now. The safest areas in a home during shelling, gunfire, or blast events are those that combine two key characteristics. They have as many walls and solid structures between you and the outside world as possible, and they have no windows, or as few windows as possible. Windows are dangerous not just because of what can come through them, but because of the glass itself. Even a blast that occurs at some distance can shatter windows and turn glass into high-velocity projectiles that cause serious injury. With those two principles in mind, basements are almost universally the safest option if your home has one. They place you below ground level, which provides significant protection from blast and fragmentation, and they typically have few or no windows. If you have a basement, that is your primary safe room, and you should make sure it is equipped and accessible. If you do not have a basement, look for interior rooms on the lowest floor of your building, bathrooms, closets, hallways, any space that has no exterior walls and no windows. These spaces use the surrounding structure of the building as a buffer. A bathroom with reinforced plumbing walls can offer meaningful protection. A hallway at the center of a building, far from exterior walls, is significantly safer than a room with large windows facing the street. In a room where you do not have access to a truly protected space, getting under or behind heavy, solid furniture, a sturdy wooden table, a heavy dresser pushed against an interior wall, can provide some measure of protection from debris and fragmentation. It is not ideal, but it is meaningfully better than being in an exposed position. Walk through your home now and identify your safe room. Make sure every member of your household knows where it is and can get there quickly in the dark, because you may need to move there fast and without light. And make sure the path to it is clear, that there is nothing blocking corridors or doorways that would slow you down in an emergency. Knowing where to shelter inside your home is one half of the location equation. The other half is knowing how to get out. Escape routes matter enormously, and like your safe room, they need to be thought through before you need them, not during. In a conflict situation, the route you normally use to leave your home may not be available. Your front door may open onto a street that is under fire. A road you normally rely on may be blocked, damaged, or controlled by hostile forces. So, you need to know your alternatives. Identify at least 2 different ways to exit your building. If you live in an apartment, know not just the main stairwell but the secondary stairwell, the service entrance, any other exit point. Know where they lead and what you would encounter once you are outside. Elevators should never be used in an emergency. Power can go out at any moment, and being trapped in an elevator during an attack is an extremely dangerous situation. Beyond your building, know the routes to the nearest designated shelter, bunker, or hardened public building in your area. Many cities in conflict zones have civil defense shelters that are mapped and publicized by local authorities. Find out where the nearest ones are to your home and to any other locations where you or your family spend significant time. Know more than one route to each of them, and know which of those routes avoids open ground, wide intersections, or areas with poor cover. Practice these routes. Walk them. Make sure your family members, including children, know them. The goal is that if you need to move, the decision of where to go and how to get there requires no thought at all. It is already embedded, it is already rehearsed, and you can execute it even when you are frightened, even when it is dark, even when the situation around you is chaotic. Preparation is not pessimism. It is not an admission that things will go wrong or a surrender to fear. It is the opposite. It is the act of taking control of what you can control, so that if things do go wrong, you are positioned to respond rather than simply to react. Every item you put in that kit, every conversation you have about safe rooms and escape routes, every piece of planning you do in the calm before any storm, it is all an investment in your own resilience. It is all work that could, when the moment comes, save your life or the lives of people you love. In the next segment, we are going to move outside the home and talk about how to navigate the world around you when conflict is active, how to move safely, how to read your environment, and how to make the kind of decisions about movement and exposure that keep you out of harm's way. Family planning and coordination. In the last segment, we talked about preparing your physical environment, your emergency kit, your safe room, your escape routes. All of that preparation is essential. But there is a dimension of survival planning that goes beyond supplies and physical spaces, and it is one that people often leave until last, perhaps because it requires confronting some uncomfortable realities. That dimension is people. Specifically, the people you love. Your family. Here's the truth that makes family coordination planning so important and so urgent. In a genuine conflict emergency, the people in your household may not be together when things escalate. You may be at work. Your children may be at school. Your partner may be across the city. And the moment that danger becomes immediate is very often not the moment when you have time to calmly call everyone, explain the situation, agree on a plan, and make your way to each other. Communication networks get overloaded. Phone lines go down. Cell towers get damaged or become so congested that calls simply cannot connect. People start moving, and in the chaos of a city or neighborhood responding to sudden danger, finding someone you love who is somewhere else can become extraordinarily difficult. The families who navigate these situations best are not the ones who figure it out in the moment. They are the ones who figured it out before the moment ever arrived. They made a plan when they had time to think clearly, when they could talk calmly, when they could ask questions and work through scenarios without the pressure of immediate danger. And because of that, when the emergency came, they did not need to communicate in real time. They already knew what to do. The plan ran itself. That is what this segment is about, building that plan for your family, in whatever form your family takes. The first and most foundational element of any family emergency plan is the reunion point. A reunion point is a pre-agreed location where all members of your family or household will go in the event that an emergency separates you and normal communication is not possible. It is the answer to the question, if everything goes wrong and we cannot reach each other by phone, Where do we go to find each other? The reunion point needs to meet several criteria to be genuinely useful. First, it needs to be outside your immediate neighborhood. This is important because many emergencies, including conflict situations, fires, and other large-scale crises, will make your immediate neighborhood inaccessible, dangerous, or both. If your reunion point is on your street, and your street is the problem, the reunion point is useless. It needs to be far enough away that it remains accessible even when the area immediately around your home does not. Second, it needs to be a specific, fixed, identifiable location. Not a general area, not somewhere near the park or around the school, but a precise spot that every member of your family can identify unambiguously. A specific building entrance, a named landmark, a particular intersection with a distinctive feature. The specificity matters because when people are frightened and moving quickly, ambiguity creates confusion, and confusion causes people to wait in the wrong place or to move to look for each other, which can make the situation worse. Third, it needs to be somewhere that offers at least some degree of shelter and relative safety. An open field in the middle of a wide road is not a good reunion point. A sturdy building with an identifiable entrance, a place of worship with solid walls, a library or community center. These are the kinds of locations that provide both a clear landmark and a degree of physical protection. Fourth, and this is worth emphasizing, you should designate more than one. A primary reunion point and a secondary reunion point that you would fall back to if the primary is inaccessible. Conflict situations change quickly, and an area that was safe when you made your plan may not be safe when you need to use it. Having a backup removes the paralysis that can occur when the primary option fails. Think about your city, your neighborhood, your family's regular geography, the places you work, the schools your children attend, the routes between all of those locations, and choose reunion points that make sense within that geography. Then make sure that every member of your family, every person who might need to use that information, knows exactly where those locations are. Knowing the reunion point is necessary, but knowledge that lives only in your head and has never been tested is much less reliable than knowledge that has been practiced. This is why walking or driving the route to your reunion point at least twice a year is genuine practical safety advice and not just a bureaucratic exercise. Twice a year might sound arbitrary, but it reflects something real about how memory and spatial familiarity work. A route you have physically traveled stays in your body in a different way than a route you have only looked at on a map or talked about at a kitchen table. You notice things when you walk a route. You see where the difficult sections are, where the exposed ground is, which parts of the path have good cover, and which parts do not. You notice when things have changed, when a building has been demolished, when a road has been closed, when the landscape has shifted in a way that affects your plan. And critically, when you practice with your family, when your children walk that route with you, when your partner moves through it alongside you, it stops being abstract and becomes something they actually know. A child who has walked to the reunion point twice can find their way there under pressure in a way that a child who is only told about it simply cannot. Make these practice walks as realistic as you reasonably can. Walk them at different times of day. Walk them in conditions that are less than ideal, in rain, in fading light, because an emergency will not wait for perfect weather. Talk through, as you walk, what you would do at various points if something were blocking your path. Where would you go if this road were impassable? What is the alternative from here? Treat it as a kind of low-stakes rehearsal for a high-stakes scenario, because that is exactly what it is. Document the routes as well. Draw them out, note them on a map, take photographs of key landmarks and waypoints. Keep a copy of this documentation in your emergency kit, and if your children are old enough, give them their own copy to keep somewhere safe. Information that exists in multiple places and multiple formats is far more resilient than information that exists only in someone's memory. Now we need to talk about something that parents of young children in particular need to address directly, because it involves a specific and very real danger that conflict situations create. When an emergency escalates quickly, when there is sudden shelling, when crowds are moving in panic, when schools are locked down and families are trying to reach their children, there is chaos. And chaos is a condition that predatory people can exploit. Children who are separated from their parents, who are frightened and disoriented and looking for help, are vulnerable to adults who may not have their best interests at heart. This is not a hypothetical concern. It is a documented reality in conflict situations around the world. The way you protect your children against this specific risk is through what is sometimes called a family code word, a secret word or short phrase that only your family knows, which a trusted adult must be able to say before a child goes anywhere with them. Here's how it works. You choose a word or phrase together as a family, something memorable and specific enough that it could not be guessed, but not so complicated that a frightened child might forget it. The understanding you establish with your children is this. If any adult, no matter who they are, no matter what they say, comes to pick you up or take you somewhere, you ask them for the code word first. If they know the code word, they are safe to go with. If they do not know the code word, even if they claim to be a friend, even if they know your name, even if they seem kind and trustworthy, you do not go with them. You stay where you are, you go to the nearest teacher or official or group of adults, and you wait. The code word serves a purpose beyond just screening unknown individuals. It also creates a mechanism that cuts through one of the most common manipulation tactics used against children in dangerous situations, the false claim of parental authorization. Someone might approach a child and say their mother sent them, their father asked them to come, it is urgent, and there is no time to wait. Without a code word, a frightened child has no reliable way to verify or refute that claim. With a code word, they do. The answer is simple and binary. You know the word, or you do not. When you establish this system with your children, be clear and be calm about it. Frame it not as something frightening, but as something empowering, a special secret that belongs to your family, a tool that gives them the ability to protect themselves. Children who understand why the code word matters are far more likely to use it correctly than children who were simply told the rule without understanding the reasoning behind it. Refresh the code word periodically, especially if you ever have reason to believe it may have been shared or compromised. And make sure that any adult who might legitimately need to pick up your children in an emergency, a trusted relative, a close family friend, knows the word well in advance so that they are not caught without it at a moment when speed matters. There is one more layer to family coordination planning that is worth addressing, and it concerns the family members who are most often left out of these conversations because the adults in the family want to protect them from fear. The very young and the elderly. Young children cannot absorb the same level of detail about an emergency plan that adults and older children can. But they can absorb more than we often give them credit for, and the most dangerous thing we can do is keep them entirely in the dark. A child who has never been told anything about what to do in an emergency is a child who will be completely dependent on the presence of a capable adult to survive one. A child who has been told, in age-appropriate terms, where to go and what to look for and what the code word is, has genuine agency that can matter in the worst moments. Tailor the conversation to the child's age. With very young children, focus on the simple things. Where to go, who is safe, what the code word is, and what to do if they're scared and alone, which is to find a group of people and stay with them rather than wandering. With older children, you can go into more detail about routes, about signals, about how to help younger siblings. The goal is that every child in your household has at least the minimum information they need to protect themselves. For elderly family members, the planning conversation needs to center on their specific capabilities and limitations. If a family member has mobility challenges, what does evacuation actually look like for them? If they have medical needs, how does the emergency kit account for those needs? Who is responsible for assisting them during movement? These are questions that need answers before they need to be acted on, and the time to find those answers is now, in a calm, unhurried conversation, not in the middle of an emergency. Family coordination planning is, at its heart, an act of love. It is the practical expression of the commitment you have to the people you care about, the recognition that caring for them means doing the hard, deliberate work of preparing to protect them even in circumstances that feel too dark to think about. The families who come through conflict situations intact are not always the ones with the most resources or the best equipment. Very often, they are the ones who talked to each other before it happened, who made a plan, who practiced it, who gave their children the tools to help themselves when the adults were not there. Those conversations and that preparation are what hold families together when everything outside the door is falling apart. In the next segment, we are going to move from family coordination to the broader environment around you, how to read the world outside your home, how to assess risk in real time, and how to make the decisions about movement and exposure that will keep you and the people you love out of the most dangerous situations. Daily precautions during conflict. There is a particular kind of challenge that does not get talked about enough when people discuss surviving conflict, and it is this. War is not always a single catastrophic event that begins and ends cleanly. For millions of people throughout history and around the world today, conflict is not a moment, it is a period. It is weeks, months, sometimes years, during which ordinary life has to continue in some form alongside the presence of extraordinary danger. People still need water. They still need food. Children still need care. Essential tasks still have to happen. And all of that means that even in an active conflict zone, people have to move through the world. They have to make daily decisions about when to go outside, where to go, how to get there, and how to behave when they arrive. Those daily decisions are what this segment is about. Because in a prolonged conflict situation, the cumulative quality of your daily decisions matters enormously. One bad decision on one day can be fatal. But more commonly, it is a pattern of decisions, a habit of unnecessary exposure, a routine that takes you through high-risk areas, a behavior that draws the wrong kind of attention, that accumulates into disaster. Conversely, a consistent set of sound daily habits can see you through situations that on the surface seem almost unsurvivable. So let us go through those habits carefully one by one, because each of them has a specific logic behind it, and understanding that logic is what makes the difference between following a rule blindly and actually applying good judgment in situations where the rule itself may not perfectly fit. The first and broadest principle of daily movement during conflict is this: avoid high-risk locations whenever it is at all possible to do so. High-risk locations in a conflict environment fall into several categories, and it is worth being specific about each of them. Military installations, checkpoints, and anything associated with active military activity are among the most dangerous places for civilians to be. This is true regardless of which side is operating them. Active military positions attract fire. They are targets. Even a position that appears to be secure and established can become the site of sudden, intense violence with little or no warning. If there is any route that takes you away from rather than through or near military zones, take that route, even if it is significantly longer. The extra time and distance is always worth it. Crowds present a different, but equally serious category of risk. Large gatherings of people, whether they are forming around a food distribution point, a rumored evacuation corridor, or simply a space where people have congregated out of fear or solidarity, can become dangerous very quickly in a conflict environment. They attract attention. They can become targets. They can also turn dangerous from within, through panic, through crushing, through the kind of chaotic mass movement that injures and kills people who are nowhere near the original source of danger. If you see a large crowd forming, your instinct should be to find an alternative, not to join it. Bridges and choke points deserve specific mention because they tend to concentrate both people and risk in ways that are not always immediately obvious. Bridges are tactically significant structures. They are often contested, often targeted, and often the site of checkpoints and military activity. In an evacuation scenario, a bridge may seem like the fastest route out, and it may also be one of the most dangerous. Know where the bridges are in your area. Treat them as elevated risk locations, and if you must use one, do so quickly, do not linger, and have an alternative in mind if it proves impassable or dangerous. When movement is necessary, travel with others rather than alone where possible. This is partly a practical consideration. A group can respond to an emergency more effectively than a single individual, can share the cognitive load of navigation and threat assessment, and can provide assistance if someone is injured. But it is also a visibility consideration in a particular sense. A single person moving through a conflict zone can appear suspicious in ways that a small family group typically does not. Context matters enormously in how armed personnel and others interpret the people they see moving around them, and a group that visibly includes women, children, or elderly individuals reads very differently than a lone individual moving quickly. When official safe routes have been designated, whether by civil defense authorities, by humanitarian organizations, or by local community networks, use them. These routes are designated for a reason. They have been assessed, at least at the time of designation, as offering a lower level of risk than alternatives. They may also be the routes that humanitarian organizations and civilian protection monitors are watching, which provides an additional layer of informal protection. Deviating from designated safe routes, even when a deviation seems to offer a shortcut or a faster path, introduces uncertainty and risk that the designated route was specifically designed to avoid. What you wear matters more than most people in ordinary life would ever think to consider, but in a conflict environment, it can be a genuinely significant safety factor. The principle is simple: blend in. Wear clothing that is neutral in color, unremarkable in style, and culturally appropriate to the civilian population around you. Earth tones, grays, dark blues, colors that do not stand out. Avoid anything that could be mistaken, even at a distance, for military or paramilitary clothing. This means avoiding camouflage patterns entirely, but it also means avoiding military-style boots, tactical vests, or anything with insignia or markings that could be misread. In a high-tension environment, a person who looks ambiguously military is a person who may be treated as a threat before anyone gets close enough to clarify the ambiguity. Avoid bright colors and white, which stand out visually and can make you more visible at distance. Do not carry equipment that could be misidentified as a weapon. Long items, in particular, can be misread from a distance in ways that have deadly consequences. The goal of your clothing and your overall appearance is to be as unremarkable as possible. You want to look like what you are, a civilian going about necessary daily business. Anything that marks you out as different, unusual, or ambiguous introduces risk that is entirely avoidable. Nighttime requires its own specific set of precautions because darkness changes the nature of the risk environment in ways that demand different behavior. The most important thing to understand about moving or being visible at night in a conflict zone is that in a modern conflict, darkness no longer provides the protection it once did. Drone technology, night vision equipment, and thermal imaging mean that armed actors can observe and target at night with significant effectiveness. What darkness does do, however, is change the signals that attract attention. And the most common signals that attract dangerous attention at night are light sources. This means phone screens. It means flashlights used carelessly. It means cigarettes, candles visible through windows, and any other source of light that could be observed from a distance and used to locate people. At night, in an active conflict zone, any visible light source can potentially mark your position to a drone operator, a sniper, or a patrol. The discipline required here is real, and it runs counter to instinct. When it is dark and we are frightened, reaching for our phones and turning on lights is a natural response. But it is a response that needs to be consciously overridden. If you must use a light source at night, use it inside, away from windows, with any gaps in curtains or coverings sealed. If you need to move at night, move without light if at all possible, using your knowledge of the route, which is another reason why practicing your routes in daylight repeatedly is so valuable. If you must use a phone, shield the screen with your body, reduce the brightness to its minimum setting, and keep the exposure as brief as possible. The broader principle for nighttime is to minimize your presence. Stay inside if you can. Keep noise low. Keep lights off or heavily obscured. Make yourself, as much as possible, invisible. Despite every precaution, there may come a moment when you encounter armed individuals or groups directly. This is one of the highest stakes situations a civilian can face in a conflict zone, and how you behave in the first seconds of that encounter can determine the outcome. The single most important thing you can do when you encounter armed personnel, regardless of who they are, regardless of which side they belong to, is to make your non-threatening status immediately and unmistakably clear. The primary way you do this is by making your hands visible. Raise them, hold them out to the sides, keep them clearly away from your body and clearly empty. In the threat assessment that an armed individual performs in the first moments of seeing an unknown person, hands are the critical variable. Hands that are visible and empty signal civilian. Hands that are concealed signal unknown threat. The difference in how you are treated can be immediate and severe. Move slowly and deliberately. Do not make sudden movements. Do not reach into pockets or bags without first explaining what you are doing and receiving some indication that it is acceptable to proceed. If you are asked to stop, stop completely and immediately. If you are asked to identify yourself, Do so calmly and cooperate fully with document checks. Do not argue. Do not challenge. Do not express anger or defiance, even if you are being treated unjustly. Your objective in that encounter is not justice. It is to get through the encounter alive and unharmed. Everything else can be addressed later. The time for argument is not when you are facing armed individuals who are in a heightened state of alert and who have the ability to harm you. If you are with children during an encounter with armed groups, keep them close and calm. Speak to them quietly and reassuringly. A crying or panicking child can escalate tension in ways that are dangerous. If you can, kneel or position yourself at a non-threatening level and keep your demeanor as calm as possible. One of the most straightforward and yet most commonly ignored pieces of advice for living through a conflict is this: when there is a curfew, respect it. Curfews are imposed in conflict zones for reasons that are directly relevant to your safety. The hours during which curfews operate are typically the hours of highest military activity, the hours when patrols are active, when the rules of engagement for armed personnel may be at their most permissive, and when the presence of a civilian on the street is most likely to be interpreted as suspicious. Being found outside during curfew hours removes the most basic protection you have as a civilian, the clear and visible distinction between you and a combatant. Beyond curfews, the broader principle is to limit your movement to what is genuinely necessary.
Every trip outside is a risk.
Every unnecessary trip outside is an unnecessary risk. That does not mean becoming a prisoner in your own home. There are things that must be done, and doing them is unavoidable. But it does mean developing a discipline around movement that asks, before every trip, whether this journey is truly necessary right now, whether it can be combined with another necessary trip to reduce overall exposure, and whether the timing can be shifted to a lower risk window of the day. When you do move, move with purpose and economy. Know where you are going before you leave. Take the safest route, not the fastest one. Do not linger in exposed areas. Do not stop to watch or investigate things that do not concern you directly. Get to where you're going, do what you need to do, and get back. The less time you spend in the open, the less exposure you have, and the less exposure you have, the safer you are. Daily life during conflict is a sustained exercise in disciplined, conscious decision-making. It is exhausting in a way that is different from the acute terror of an immediate attack. It is a slower, grinding kind of vigilance that has to be maintained day after day after day. And one of the risks of that sustained vigilance is that it erodes. People become fatigued by precautions. They start taking small shortcuts. They stop seeing the risk in behaviors that have become routine. That gradual erosion of discipline is itself a dangerous thing. The way you guard against it is by remembering the logic behind each precaution, not just the rule itself. When you understand why neutral clothing matters, why lights at night are dangerous, why you move slowly and keep your hands visible, you do not need to rely on willpower alone to maintain the behavior. The understanding itself keeps the behavior in place, even when you are tired, even when the risk on any given day seems lower than usual. In the next segment, we are going to go deeper into the physical environment of conflict, specifically what to do and where to go when an attack happens suddenly and without warning, and you have seconds rather than minutes to make a decision that could save your life. When an attack happens, everything we have covered so far has been about the space before danger arrives. Preparation, planning, daily discipline, the slow, careful work of reducing your risk profile and building your readiness. All of that matters enormously, and none of it is wasted. But there is a moment that all of that preparation is ultimately pointing toward, and it is the moment we are going to talk about now. The moment when an attack actually happens. This is the segment that people most want to skip when they're doing this kind of preparation because it requires sitting with something genuinely uncomfortable, the concrete, specific reality of what it is like when the danger is not theoretical anymore, when it is not a plan you are making or a route you are practicing, but an actual event unfolding around you in real time. Shells falling, gunfire erupting, the world suddenly violent and loud and immediate. But this is also the segment where the right information can make the most dramatic difference to whether you survive. Because in the moment an attack begins, most people do the wrong things. Not because they are foolish or cowardly, but because the human body under sudden extreme threat operates on instinct, and our instincts were not designed for the specific physics of modern warfare. They were not calibrated for blast waves and fragmentation and the particular geometry of how bullets travel through urban environments. Left to pure instinct, most people will do things that feel right but are actually dangerous. And knowing that and knowing what to do instead is the entire point of this segment. Let us go through the scenarios carefully because each one is different, and the right response in one can be the wrong response in another. You are outdoors. Maybe you are moving between locations, maybe you are in a market, maybe you are crossing a road. And then it starts. The sound of incoming fire, an explosion nearby, an airstrike. Suddenly you are in the open with nowhere immediately obvious to go. The first and most important thing to do is also the thing that runs most directly against instinct. Do not run. Running feels like the right response. Every part of your body is screaming at you to move, to get away, to put distance between yourself and the danger. But in the context of shelling and airstrikes, running does several things that make your situation worse rather than better. It keeps you upright, which is the most exposed position your body can be in relative to blast and fragmentation. It causes you to move in ways that are unpredictable to yourself. You are running without a specific destination, driven by panic rather than judgment, and you may run toward danger rather than away from it. And it exhausts you, which matters if you subsequently need to move deliberately and carefully. What you do instead is drop. Immediately and completely. Get yourself flat on the ground, as low as you can get, and do it the moment you register that an attack is underway. Do not wait to assess the situation. Do not wait to see what others are doing. Do not take the extra seconds to look for a better option. Drop now and assess from the ground. The physics behind this are straightforward. The primary killers in a shelling or airstrike are blast overpressure and fragmentation, pieces of metal traveling at extremely high velocity outward from the point of explosion. Fragmentation travels in patterns that are broadly influenced by gravity and by the geometry of the explosion, and the lower you are to the ground, the smaller a target you present to that fragmentation pattern. A person lying flat on the ground is exponentially less exposed to lateral fragmentation than a person standing upright. The ground itself also provides a degree of protection. Being in contact with it means you are below the primary fragmentation dispersal zone. As you drop, cover your head and neck with your arms. Your head is where a relatively small injury can be immediately fatal, and protecting it is the instinctive thing to do. But make sure you are doing it deliberately with your arms actually covering the back of your skull and neck, not just tucked under your body. Once you are flat, move, crawl, do not run, toward the nearest available cover. The best options are walls and ditches. A wall gives you a solid barrier between yourself and the direction of the threat, and being pressed against the base of a wall means you are in one of the lowest exposure positions available in an open environment. A ditch or depression in the ground takes you below the surface level, which further reduces your exposure to fragmentation. Even a relatively shallow depression, a curb, a drainage channel, a slight drop in the ground level, is meaningfully better than flat, open ground. What you want to avoid beyond running in the open is taking cover near vehicles, particularly fuel tanks, or near structures that are likely to be secondary targets, things that are themselves militarily significant and therefore likely to attract further fire. A wall of a civilian building is better cover than the wall of a military vehicle. A natural depression in the ground is better than a metal container that could itself become fragmentation.
Stay down.
Stay still.
Wait.
The instinct after an initial explosion is to get up and move once the immediate blast has passed, and this instinct gets people killed because attacks rarely consist of a single event. Shelling comes in multiple rounds. Airstrikes are often followed by additional strikes on the same target. The most dangerous moment is very often not the first explosion but the moments immediately after, when people instinctively rise and move and expose themselves to what comes next. Stay flat, stay covered, and do not move until you have a clear, deliberate plan for where you are going and genuine reason to believe it is safe to move. Now let's shift to the scenario where you are indoors when an attack begins, because the environment changes the calculus significantly and the right response is different in important ways. The first thing to understand about being indoors during shelling or an airstrike is that not all parts of a building are equally safe, and the instinctive place to be, near a window, watching what is happening outside, is one of the most dangerous. Windows are death in an explosive attack. Glass does not simply break when a blast occurs near a building. It shatters violently, explosively, propelling razor-edged fragments at high velocity through the interior space. People who are standing or sitting near windows when a blast occurs in the vicinity, even a blast that does not directly hit their building, sustain horrific injuries from glass alone, quite apart from any direct structural damage. The moment you register that an attack is occurring, move away from every window in your vicinity. Do not stop to look out. Do not pause at the edge to assess what is happening. Move away. Where you want to be is in the lowest, most central part of your building. Low, because lower floors and basements are further from the structural damage that typically begins at roof level and works downward, and because being below ground level provides protection that no above-ground floor can match. Central, because the further you are from exterior walls and windows, the more of the building structure sits between you and whatever is happening outside. Interior corridors, central stairwells, bathrooms on interior walls. These are the kinds of spaces that put the maximum amount of building material between you and external threats. Once you are in that space, get under something sturdy. A heavy table is the classic guidance, and the reason for it is specific. In a structural collapse, which is a real possibility if your building takes a direct hit, a sturdy table creates what rescue professionals call a survival void, a space within the debris where a person can survive even when the structure around them has failed. It is not a guarantee of survival in a direct hit, but it meaningfully improves your odds compared to being in the open interior of a collapsing space. Stay away from heavy objects that are mounted on walls, bookshelves, cabinets, mirrors, because these can fall and cause serious injury from the vibration of nearby blasts, even without a direct hit on your building. Get low, get under something solid, cover your head, and stay as still as possible. If you have time before you need to take cover, if you have even 60 seconds of warning, grab your emergency kit if it is accessible, and bring any family members together in the safe room. But do not sacrifice safety for supplies. If the attack is immediate, your body is more important than your bag. Get to safety first. The third scenario is the one that many people find most psychologically difficult to prepare for, because it involves a particular kind of helplessness. You're caught in crossfire. Gunfire is coming from multiple directions, or you are between armed groups that are engaging each other, and you have no immediate safe position to move to. The first and most critical rule in a crossfire situation is to get horizontal immediately, for the same reasons we discussed in the outdoor shelling scenario. Bullets travel at high velocity in relatively flat trajectories, and a person standing upright in a crossfire is presenting the maximum possible target profile to fire coming from multiple directions. Get on the ground, and get there immediately. From the ground, your objective is to reach cover. And here the distinction between cover and concealment is one of the most important things you can know. Concealment means something hides you from view, a bush, a car door, a thin partition wall. Cover means something will actually stop a bullet, concrete, solid brick walls, large rocks, engine blocks. In a crossfire situation, concealment without cover is almost meaningless. You need something that will physically stop the rounds being fired, not just something that prevents you from being seen. Crawl to the nearest genuine cover. Keep your body as flat and low as possible as you move. Move on your elbows and knees, keeping your profile as close to the ground as you can. This is slow, and it feels agonizingly slow when your instinct is to sprint. But sprinting across open ground in a crossfire is extremely dangerous. Crawling while staying low dramatically reduces your exposure. Once you have reached cover, stay there. Do not look around the edge of your cover out of curiosity or to assess the situation. This is one of the most common causes of injury in exactly these situations. If you need to observe, make the smallest possible exposure of your head from the lowest possible position for the shortest possible time. Then wait. And this is perhaps the hardest instruction of all, because waiting while gunfire is happening feels completely contrary to every survival instinct. But movement during active fire is extraordinarily dangerous. The moments when fire pauses, when both sides are reloading, repositioning, or reassessing, are the windows you are waiting for. In a sustained firefight, these pauses happen. They may be brief, but they are real. Listen for them. Feel for them. And when a genuine pause occurs, use it to move, deliberately, low, toward better cover or toward an exit from the crossfire zone. Move in short distances between covered positions rather than attempting to cross large open areas in a single movement. Get to one piece of cover, pause, assess, then move to the next. This is slow. It can feel impossibly slow, but it is the method that keeps you in contact with protection at every stage of your movement rather than leaving you exposed in the open. If you are with other people in a crossfire, move one at a time while others remain in cover. Do not all move simultaneously, because if you must cross any open ground, having everyone exposed at once multiplies the risk. One person moves, reaches cover, and the next moves while the first provides whatever support they can from their new position. There is something that needs to be said about the emotional reality of these moments, because the instructions I've just given you, drop flat, crawl to cover, stay still, wait for a pause, are simple to describe and genuinely difficult to execute when your nervous system is in a state of extreme fear. Fear in a life-threatening situation is not a weakness. It is a biological response, and it is there for a reason. But it can also work against you by triggering impulsive action, the sprint across open ground, the instinctive rise to look after the first explosion, the panicked run that feels like survival but is actually exposure. The way you manage that response is not by eliminating the fear, which you cannot do, but by having the correct actions so deeply understood and so firmly established in your mind that they override the impulsive response. This is why knowing these things in advance matters so profoundly. In the moment, you will not have the cognitive bandwidth to reason through your options from first principles. You will not be able to think clearly about blast fragmentation patterns or the physics of crossfire trajectories. But if you have already done that thinking, if the right actions are already part of what you know before the moment arrives, they become available to you even when your conscious mind is overwhelmed. You do not need to think. You just need to do what you already know. Drop flat. Cover your head. Crawl to cover. Stay low. Move in the pauses. These are the actions that the evidence of conflict survival, gathered across generations and across every theater of war, consistently identifies as the ones that keep civilians alive when attacks happen suddenly and without warning. In the next segment, we are going to move beyond the immediate attack and talk about what comes after, how to assess your situation once the immediate danger has passed, how to treat injuries when professional medical help is not available, and how to begin the process of stabilizing yourself and the people around you in the aftermath of violence. Encounters with armed groups. Of all the scenarios we cover in this video, the one that generates the most anxiety when people think about it in advance is probably this one. Not the distant sound of shelling, not the abstract planning of escape routes, but the immediate, personal, human encounter with someone who is armed and who has power over what happens to you next. The checkpoint you did not expect. The patrol that rounds a corner as you are crossing a street. The armed individuals who enter a building you are sheltering in. The moment when conflict stops being an environmental threat and becomes a face-to-face human one. It is worth saying clearly at the outset of this segment that no set of instructions can guarantee your safety in every possible version of this encounter. Armed groups in conflict zones vary enormously in their discipline, in their objectives, in the rules they operate under, in how they treat civilians. Some are professional military forces with clear rules of engagement and genuine accountability. Others are irregular militias with little oversight and unpredictable behavior. Understanding that variation is important because it means the goal of this segment is not to give you a script that works in every situation. The goal is to give you a foundation of behavior and understanding that maximizes your chances across the widest possible range of encounters and to help you think clearly about the specific situations that fall outside that foundation. With that said, let us start with what the evidence of conflict zones consistently tells us about the encounters that civilians survive most reliably and what those encounters have in common. The single most consistent finding across accounts from conflict survivors, humanitarian workers, and conflict zone journalists about encounters with armed groups is this: calm is protective. Not calm as performance, not calm as a mask over panic, but genuine behavioral calm. The absence of sudden movements, the absence of raised voices, the absence of anything that registers as threatening or unpredictable to someone who is already in a state of heightened alert and is holding a weapon. The reason calm is protective is rooted in the psychology of the armed individual you are facing. People carrying weapons in active conflict zones are operating under sustained stress, often with incomplete information about who is a threat and who is not. Their threat assessment is happening fast, and the signals they are reading are largely behavioral. A civilian who is visibly panicked, who is moving erratically, who is shouting or arguing or making sudden gestures, generates ambiguous signals in that assessment. Ambiguity, for someone in that psychological state, tends to resolve toward threat. A civilian who is still, who is calm, who is moving slowly and predictably, generates clear signals. Clear signals, in most cases, resolve toward non-threat. This is not a guarantee. There are armed individuals in conflict zones who will harm civilians regardless of behavior, and no amount of calm will change that outcome. But across the vast majority of civilian encounters with armed groups, calm behavior is statistically protective, and that is what we are trying to optimize for. So when an encounter begins, when you first register that you are in the presence of armed individuals, the first thing you do is consciously slow yourself down. Take a breath if you can. Slow your movements to deliberate, visible, predictable actions. Lower your voice if you were speaking. If you were moving, stop.
Be still.
Let them assess you, and let what they see be a civilian who is not a threat. Make no sudden movements. This instruction is simple, it is consistent across every conflict zone survival guide ever written, and it deserves more explanation than it usually gets, because understanding exactly why it matters so much helps you apply it correctly in situations where the specific form of the movement varies. Armed individuals at checkpoints and on patrols are trained or habituated to respond rapidly to sudden movement. In the context they are operating in, sudden movement from an unknown civilian can indicate an attack, an attempt to draw a weapon, or an attempt to flee. The response to perceived sudden movement can be immediate and lethal because the alternative, hesitating to assess whether the movement is actually threatening, can be fatal for the armed individual if the movement was in fact an attack. What this means practically is that you need to make every movement visible, slow, and explained before you make it. If you are going to reach into your pocket for your identification documents, you do not simply reach into your pocket. You say, slowly and clearly, that you are going to reach into your pocket for your documents. You wait for some acknowledgement, even a nod, before you move. Then you move slowly, deliberately, and with your eyes on the person you are speaking to. You show them what you are doing at every stage. If you need to turn around, you do it slowly. If you need to pick something up from the ground, you explain first. If you are with children and a child begins to move suddenly out of anxiety or fear, you put a gentle, calm hand on them and keep them still. Every movement you make in the presence of armed individuals should be one that could be watched in slow motion without generating alarm. This extends to your face and your voice as well. Avoid expressions of defiance, contempt, or anger, even if you feel all of those things. Keep your face neutral and your voice level. Answer questions directly and concisely. Do not volunteer information that was not asked for, as excess information can create confusion and confusion can create danger. And do not argue. This is worth stating separately because the instinct to argue, to explain why a search is unjust, to assert your rights, to challenge a demand you know to be wrong, is very human and very understandable. But an argument with an armed individual in a conflict zone is not a dispute you can win in the conventional sense. The only outcome that matters is getting through the encounter unharmed. Save the argument for later, for a time and a place where it can actually be had safely. Now we come to the scenario that is in some ways the most difficult to address, because it involves a decision made under extreme time pressure with extremely high stakes, and the right answer depends on variables that you'll have to assess in real time. What do you do if you need to flee? The first thing to say is that fleeing is generally the last resort in an encounter with an armed group, not the first response. Attempting to run from armed individuals who have already engaged with you, who are at a checkpoint you have approached, or who have directly addressed you, is extremely dangerous. It will almost certainly be interpreted as evidence of guilt or a threat, and the response can be immediate lethal fire. If there is any possibility of talking your way through an encounter, staying calm and complying will almost always be a safer option than attempting to run. But there are situations, Situations where violence is already occurring, where you have not yet been directly engaged but are in the vicinity of an armed group that is acting with lethal intent toward civilians, where the threat is immediate and compliance clearly offers no protection, where movement away from danger is the correct choice. And if you are moving away from armed individuals who may be targeting you, the way you move matters. Running in a straight line makes you a straightforward target to track and to fire upon. A person running in a straight line predictably occupies a series of positions that can be anticipated, aimed at, and hit. A person moving in an irregular, unpredictable pattern, changing direction, varying pace, moving in ways that cannot be easily predicted, is a significantly harder target. This is the logic behind the guidance to move in a zigzag pattern when fleeing under fire. It is not about speed, it is about unpredictability. You are trying to make it as difficult as possible to track your movement and put accurate fire on your position. Move between cover points wherever possible rather than across open ground. If there is a wall, a vehicle, a corner, a building entrance that you can reach with a short burst of movement, move to it, pause behind it, assess, and then move to the next piece of cover. Every piece of solid cover you put between yourself and the threat reduces your exposure, and moving between cover points also introduces additional unpredictability into your movement that makes accurate targeting harder. Move low. Not necessarily crawling when you are running, but crouched, your profile reduced, your center of gravity lower than it would be in an upright sprint. A lower profile is a smaller target. And once you have reached cover or have put meaningful distance between yourself and the immediate threat, stop moving in the open. Find concealment or cover, stay still, stay low, and reassess before moving again. Movement in the open is always the highest risk state. Stillness behind cover is always safer than movement in the open, and the discipline to stop and hold rather than continuing to run is one of the hardest but most important things to maintain under this kind of pressure. There is a final scenario in this segment that we need to address directly, because it represents a particular kind of situation that civilians sometimes find themselves in, and it is one where the options are severely constrained. You are caught between two forces. The fighting is on multiple sides of you. You cannot move in any direction without risk of moving toward armed groups rather than away from them, and you need to communicate to everyone around you that you are a civilian who is not a party to the conflict. The universal signal for this, recognized across virtually every conflict and every military force in the world, with a history going back more than a century, is a white flag. A white cloth, a white shirt, anything white held up or tied visibly in a way that can be seen from a distance. White as a symbol of non-combatant status and willingness to communicate has deep roots in the laws and customs of war. It is recognized under international humanitarian law as a protective signal. It does not guarantee your safety. Nothing in an active conflict does, but it communicates, in a language that transcends spoken words and that armed personnel on all sides are trained to recognize, that you are not a fighting party and that you are seeking not to engage but to be identified as a civilian. Keep something white in your emergency kit and on your person for exactly this reason. A white cloth is lightweight and takes up almost no space. If you find yourself in a situation where you need to move through or signal across an area where multiple armed groups are present, displaying that signal as visibly and clearly as possible while moving slowly, with your other hand raised, gives you the best available protection in a situation where your options are very limited. Display it from a position of cover where possible before you begin to move, so that it can be seen before you expose yourself. Move slowly, keep it raised, and do not make any other movements that could be interpreted as threatening while you're displaying it. It is also worth knowing, in these situations, that international humanitarian organizations, the Red Cross, Red Crescent, and others, operate in many conflict zones and are specifically mandated to assist civilians caught between forces. If you have any means of reaching or signaling these organizations, doing so is worth attempting. Their emblems, the Red Cross on white, the Red Crescent, carry legal protections under international law, and their personnel are specifically trained to move through conflict zones and reach civilians in exactly the situations we are describing. Encounters with armed groups are, in many ways, the scenario that the rest of conflict survival is designed to help you avoid reaching. All of the preparation, the awareness, the daily precautions, the movement discipline, much of that is in service of reducing the chances that you ever find yourself in a direct, face-to-face encounter with armed individuals in circumstances where your safety cannot be guaranteed. But if that encounter does happen, what you now know gives you the best available foundation for getting through it. Calm, still, slow, predictable behavior. No sudden movements, no arguments, no escalation. Compliance with demands as the path of lowest risk and preservation of your physical safety as the only objective that matters in the moment. And in the situations where movement becomes necessary, unpredictable movement between cover points, as low and as fast as your situation allows, with the white signal available and displayed when you need to communicate your civilian status across distance. In the next segment, we are going to shift from the immediacy of attack and encounter to the challenge that comes after, how to sustain yourself and the people around you over a longer period, how to manage resources when supply chains fail, and how to make decisions about staying versus leaving when both options carry significant risk. Movement and navigation. There comes a point in almost every conflict situation where staying in one place is no longer the safest option. It might come early if your home or neighborhood becomes directly targeted. It might come later, after days or weeks of sheltering in place, when supplies run out or the situation deteriorates to the point where remaining becomes more dangerous than moving. It might come as a sudden decision forced by an immediate threat, or it might come as a deliberate, planned choice made after careful assessment of changing conditions. But for the vast majority of people who live through extended conflict, the moment of movement comes. And when it does, how you move, the decisions you make about route, pace, pattern, and navigation can be as consequential as any other survival decision you will make. This segment is about that movement. Not the panicked sprint away from immediate danger that we talked about in earlier segments, but the deliberate, sustained movement of people trying to travel from one place to another through an environment that is actively dangerous. The journey from a compromised shelter to a safer location. The movement through contested terrain toward an evacuation corridor. The navigation through a city or landscape that has been changed by conflict in ways that make familiar routes unreliable or impassable. This kind of movement has its own logic, its own techniques, and its own discipline, and understanding them before you need them is the difference between movement that gets you to safety and movement that exposes you unnecessarily and compounds your risk. The foundational principle of movement in a conflict environment is one that runs counter to the most basic instinct people have when they want to get from one place to another quickly. That instinct is to move in a straight line, as directly and as continuously as possible toward the destination. In ordinary life, this is correct. In a conflict environment, it is dangerous. Straight line, continuous movement has two significant problems. First, it is predictable. A person or a group moving in a consistent direction at a consistent pace along a visible route is easy to track, easy to anticipate, and easy to target. Predictability in an environment where there are armed actors, whether that is military forces, snipers, patrols, or others, is always a vulnerability. The less predictable your movement, the harder you are to track and engage. Second, continuous movement means continuous exposure. Every moment you are moving in the open, you are visible. Every moment you are visible, you are potentially a target or a point of interest to anyone observing the environment. The alternative to continuous movement is movement in short, deliberate stages, what military personnel and conflict zone professionals sometimes describe as moving in bounds or in short leaps. Here is how it works. Rather than moving continuously as a group from your starting point to your destination, you move in stages. One person, or a small number of people, moves a short distance to the next available covered or concealed position, the corner of a building, a section of wall, a vehicle, a natural feature that provides cover. They reach that position, stop, and observe. They watch the route ahead, the surrounding environment, and the route behind, assessing for any indication of threat. Only when they have assessed the next bound and determined it to be as safe as they can establish does the rest of the group move forward to join them. Then the process repeats. Someone moves to the next position while others watch. Others follow when the position is established and assessed. This method is slower than continuous movement, significantly slower. And that slowness can feel deeply counterproductive when you are trying to cover distance in a dangerous environment. But it offers something that continuous movement cannot. At every moment of movement, There are eyes watching, assessing, ready to signal if something is wrong before the entire group is committed and exposed. And at every moment of stillness, the group is in a covered or concealed position rather than in the open. The exposure that this method accumulates over a journey is dramatically less than the exposure accumulated by the same group moving continuously in the open, even if the total journey time is longer. Practice this method in your mind before you need to use it. Think about the kinds of routes you might need to travel, the kinds of cover available along those routes, and how you would break that movement into stages. If you are moving as a family or a group, decide in advance who makes the first move and who watches, how you will signal that a position is clear, and what the signal is if it is not. These decisions made in advance, in calm, become automatic under pressure in a way that decisions made in the moment never can. Navigation seems, at first, like it should be the simple part of movement. You know where you are, you know where you're going, you use a map or a phone to get there. But conflict strips away the technological and infrastructural assumptions that modern navigation depends on, often very quickly and very completely. Phone batteries die. Chargers become inaccessible. Cell networks go down or become so congested as to be non-functional. GPS can be jammed in active conflict zones. Military forces sometimes deliberately disrupt GPS signals in areas of operation, and this disruption affects civilian devices just as it affects military ones. The digital navigation tools that most people in the modern world have come to rely on so completely that they have largely stopped developing any alternative capability can simply cease to function. When they do, you need to be able to navigate without them. And the tools for doing that are old, reliable, and entirely independent of any technology that can be disrupted. The sun and the stars have been used for navigation by human beings for thousands of years, and they remain entirely functional in a conflict zone. Learning to use them is not complicated, and the basic principles can be understood and applied with no special equipment. The sun rises in the east and sets in the west. This is the most basic navigational fact available to anyone outdoors in daylight, and it is enough to establish your cardinal directions with reasonable accuracy at any point in the day. In the morning, the sun is broadly to your east. In the evening, it is broadly to your west. At midday in the northern hemisphere, it is to your south. At midday in the southern hemisphere, it is to your north. If you know roughly what time it is and you can see the sun, you can determine roughly which direction is which. For more precise daytime navigation using the sun, the shadow stick method has been used for millennia. Push a straight stick into the ground and mark the tip of its shadow with a stone or a scratch in the soil. Wait 15 to 20 minutes and mark the tip of the shadow again. The line between your first mark and your second mark runs roughly east to west, with the first mark to the west and the second to the east. A line perpendicular to this runs roughly north to south. This method works anywhere in the world where the sun is visible and produces usable directional accuracy for the purpose of maintaining a general heading. At night, in the northern hemisphere, the North Star, Polaris, sits almost directly above the geographic North Pole and does not appear to move as the night progresses. Locating it is straightforward. Find the constellation of the Big Dipper, identify the two stars that form the outer edge of the Dipper's cup, and follow the line they form outward from the cup by approximately 5 times the distance between those two stars. The bright star at the end of that line is Polaris. Face it, and you are facing north. In the southern hemisphere, the Southern Cross serves an analogous navigational function, and the method for using it to determine south is similarly reliable once learned. These are not precision navigation tools. They will not give you the turn-by-turn accuracy of a GPS device. But they will tell you what direction you are traveling in, which is often all you need to maintain a general heading toward a destination you already know the rough direction of. And they will do it reliably, regardless of network availability, battery level, or electromagnetic disruption. Physical maps, paper maps, are one of the most valuable and most consistently underestimated items you can have in a conflict situation. They require no power, no network, no signal. They cannot be jammed or disrupted. They do not run out of battery. And they contain information about the physical landscape, road networks, waterways, and settlements that can be critically important for navigation and route planning when digital tools are unavailable. Get a detailed physical map of your region, your city, and the areas between your current location and the places you might need to reach, evacuation destinations, shelter locations, border crossings, areas of relative safety. Keep it in your emergency kit, in a waterproof sleeve or bag, alongside any other physical navigation materials. Now, one of the practical challenges of using a paper map in a conflict situation is that many of the moments when you will need to consult it will be moments of low light. Nighttime movement, or movement in the interior of a damaged building, or simply the reduced visibility of a heavily overcast day in a landscape without reliable artificial lighting. And the standard tools for annotating maps, ballpoint pens, regular markers, are difficult or impossible to see in low-light conditions. A grease pencil, sometimes called a chinograph pencil or a wax pencil, solves this problem in a way that most people would not think of in advance. Grease pencils write on virtually any surface, including map laminate and plastic map sleeves, with a thick, highly visible line. Their markings are durable and weather-resistant. And critically, their marks can be read in very low light and can be made and erased. Grease pencil marks wipe off smooth surfaces cleanly, allowing you to update your map as your situation changes without destroying the underlying cartographic information. Use a grease pencil to mark your current position, your intended route, your alternative routes, known danger areas, and any other critical navigational information on your map before you move. Update these marks as your situation develops. If a route you intended to take proves impassable, mark it accordingly and mark your alternative. If you receive information about the location of checkpoints, hostile positions, or areas of active fighting, mark those too. Your map, annotated in real time with a grease pencil, becomes a living document of your navigational situation that is readable in conditions where most other forms of documentation are not. Keep it oriented correctly as you move. Periodically align it with your actual surroundings to maintain your understanding of your position relative to the landscape around you. If you are moving as a group, designate one person as the primary navigator whose job is to track your position on the map, call out upcoming decision points and route choices, and update the annotations as you move. Navigation is a cognitive task that competes with the other demands of moving through a dangerous environment, and having one person dedicated to it frees everyone else to focus on observation and security. There is a dimension of navigation in conflict zones that goes beyond the mechanical question of finding your direction and following a route, and it has to do with how the landscape itself changes when conflict is active. Routes that appear on a map as viable roads or paths may have become impassable. Bridges may have been destroyed. Buildings that previously offered landmarks for orientation may no longer exist or may be so damaged as to be unrecognizable. New barriers, walls, earthworks, military fortifications may have appeared where the map shows open space. And some areas that the map shows as open and accessible may be under observation, controlled by armed groups, or actively dangerous in ways that no map can capture. This means that navigation in a conflict zone is never purely a map-reading exercise. It is a continuous process of reconciling the information on your map with what you are actually observing in the real world and updating your plan accordingly. The map tells you what was there. Your eyes tell you what is there now. Good navigation in conflict combines both inputs constantly. Pay attention to signs of danger as you navigate. People moving quickly in the opposite direction to your intended route is a significant signal. Find out why before you continue. Absence of civilians in an area that should have them is a signal. Sound carries information about what is happening ahead of you, and the character of sounds, the direction and distance of any gunfire, the presence or absence of vehicle movement, gives you information about your route that your map cannot. Use all of your senses as navigational tools, not just your eyes and not just your map. Be willing to change your plan. This is one of the harder disciplines of conflict navigation because planning a route takes effort and abandoning that plan feels like failure and loss of control. But the map is not the territory. Your plan is not reality. If the route you planned is blocked, or has become dangerous, or has changed in ways that make it inadvisable, changing your plan is not failure. It is exactly the kind of adaptive judgment that keeps you safe. Know your alternatives before you set out, so that the decision to change course is a decision between known options rather than an improvisation from zero. Movement in conflict is one of the highest risk activities a civilian can undertake, and it deserves the same careful, deliberate preparation that we have applied to every other aspect of survival in this video. Know your route before you travel it. Know your alternatives. Navigate without relying on technology that may not function. Move in stages, with observation, rather than continuously in the open. And stay responsive to what the real world is telling you, updating your plan as your situation demands. In the next segment, we're going to address something that becomes increasingly critical as any conflict situation extends over time: how to maintain access to the most basic resources that sustain life, and how to think about the longer-term challenge of surviving not just the immediate crisis, but the weeks and months that can follow it. Survival in the field. Everything we have covered so far has assumed, at least in part, that you have access to some form of built structure. A home, a shelter, a building you can move between. The safe room in your house, the designated shelter down the road, the hardened building you identified as a refuge point in your family plan. All of that guidance is built on the assumption that walls and roofs are available to you, and for the majority of people navigating conflict situations, that assumption holds, at least for most of the time. But not always. And not for everyone. There are situations in which people find themselves without access to any built shelter for extended periods. A family that has evacuated and been cut off from their intended destination. A person who has had to leave their home with no clear route to safety and no immediate alternative. Aid workers or journalists operating in areas where infrastructure has been completely destroyed. Individuals who, for any number of reasons, find themselves needing to survive outside, in the open, in terrain that may itself be contested or dangerous. For those situations, the skills in this segment are not supplementary. They are primary. And even for people who never expect to need them, they represent a foundation of practical knowledge that is worth carrying, because the unexpected is precisely the nature of conflict. What you prepare for and what you actually face are rarely identical, and the broader your base of skills, the more options you have when the situation does not match your plan. This segment covers 3 areas that form the foundation of field survival: concealment, shelter, and fire. Each of them addresses a fundamental need, and each of them requires a different set of techniques when you are operating in the open, without the infrastructure of a built environment. Let us start with concealment, because in a conflict environment, being seen is often as dangerous as being in the wrong place. The ability to reduce your visual signature, to make yourself, your group, your shelter, and your equipment harder to detect from a distance, is one of the most valuable skills in field survival, and it begins with understanding how human eyes, and increasingly cameras and sensors, detect things in a natural environment. The human visual system, and most optical detection systems, work by identifying contrast and pattern. We see things that look different from their surroundings, things that are brighter, darker, more reflective, or differently shaped than the background they are set against. We also recognize patterns, and in particular we recognize the specific patterns associated with human beings and human-made objects: straight lines, regular geometric shapes, the particular silhouette of a human head and shoulders. Natural environments, by contrast, are characterized by irregular shapes, varied textures, and broken, asymmetric patterns. The goal of concealment is to make yourself and your equipment look, as much as possible, like the natural environment around you rather than like the human-made objects and human beings that you are. The closer your visual profile matches the background you are set against, the harder you are to detect. The most immediately available material for doing this is earth itself. Mud, applied to exposed skin and to the surfaces of equipment, does several things simultaneously. It reduces the natural reflectivity of skin, which can catch and reflect light in ways that are detectable at significant distances. It breaks up the uniform appearance of surfaces like clothing fabric or equipment cases, which tend to have a regularity that stands out against natural backgrounds. And it introduces color and texture that matches the ground and vegetation of the surrounding environment. If mud is not available, charcoal from a dead fire serves many of the same functions and can be ground up and applied in a similar way. Dark, matte, non-reflective coverage of exposed skin and shiny surfaces is the objective. Pay particular attention to the face and hands, which are the most exposed and reflective parts of the body in typical clothing. The forehead, nose, and cheekbones are the areas that catch the most light and are the most visible at distance.
Cover them thoroughly.
Hands, which move and therefore draw the eye, should also be covered. Beyond the body, concealing your shelter and any vehicles or large equipment requires a similar logic applied at a larger scale. A tarpaulin, a vehicle, a built shelter, these all have shapes, colors, and textures that stand out from natural surroundings. Covering them with vegetation gathered from the immediate environment, branches, leaves, grass, whatever is abundant and matches the color of the surroundings, breaks up their outline and integrates them visually into the background. The key principle when applying vegetation as camouflage is to use material from the immediate environment rather than material brought from elsewhere. Vegetation from a different area can look subtly wrong, a different shade of green, a different leaf shape, a different texture, and that wrongness can attract attention rather than deflect it. Cut or gather from what is immediately around you and replace it regularly, because vegetation wilts and browns quickly once cut, and dried brown material against green surroundings creates exactly the kind of contrast you are trying to avoid. Cover the entire profile of what you are concealing, not just the top or the front. Observation can come from multiple angles, including from above in environments where aerial surveillance is a factor, and gaps in concealment are visible. Think about how your shelter or vehicle looks from multiple angles, including from any elevated ground in the vicinity, and fill in gaps accordingly. Keep concealment updated as conditions change. If you move from a wooded area to a more open one, the vegetation that worked in the trees may not work in the open grass. If the season is changing and the color of the surrounding vegetation is shifting, your camouflage needs to shift with it. Concealment is not a one-time task. It is an ongoing process of matching your profile to your current environment. Shelter in a field environment serves the same fundamental purposes as shelter in a built environment: protection from the elements, insulation against temperature extremes, and a degree of concealment and psychological security, but it has to be achieved with the materials and resources available in the natural environment, combined with whatever portable equipment you have been able to carry. The lean-to is the most practical and most universally applicable field shelter design for someone with access to a tarpaulin or poncho, and it has the additional advantages of being quick to construct, easy to dismantle and pack when you need to move, and adaptable to a wide range of terrains and conditions. The basic construction is straightforward. Find 2 trees that are roughly the distance apart you need for your shelter, wide enough to accommodate the people who will shelter under it, close enough that a tarpaulin or poncho can be strung between them with enough tension to shed rain. Tie a line between the 2 trees at roughly chest height, or use a strong branch lodged between them. Drape your tarpaulin or poncho over this line so that one edge reaches the ground on the side you want the back of your shelter to be, and stake or weigh down that back edge close to the ground. The front remains open, facing away from the prevailing wind direction if possible. The angle of the slope matters for weather resistance. A steeper angle sheds rain more effectively, but reduces the interior space of the shelter. A shallower angle gives you more usable interior space, but is more vulnerable to heavy rain driving under the tarpaulin. In heavy rain conditions, err toward the steeper angle. In mild conditions where interior space matters more, a shallower angle is workable. Where trees of the right spacing are not available, improvise your ridge pole using the longest straight branches you can find, propped into an A-frame structure or leaned against any stable elevated point, a large rock, a bank of earth, a section of damaged structure, if available. The principle is the same regardless of what you are using as the central support. Once the basic structure is in place, the interior floor needs to be insulated from the ground. Ground contact is one of the most significant sources of heat loss in field conditions because soil conducts heat away from the body efficiently and ground surfaces are typically cold and damp. A layer of dry material between your body and the ground dramatically reduces this heat loss. Dry leaves, pine needles, grass, or pine boughs all work well for this purpose. The thicker the layer, the better the insulation. Aim for several inches of depth if materials are available. Pine boughs deserve specific mention because their structure, the way the individual needles cluster along the branch, creates natural pockets of trapped air when layered, and trapped air is the fundamental mechanism of all thermal insulation. A bed of layered pine boughs is not only softer than bare ground but is genuinely effective at reducing heat loss in a way that its low weight and easy availability make it one of the best field insulation materials in forested environments. Build up the sides of your lean-to with additional branches, leaves, or whatever material is available to reduce the amount of cold air that can enter from the sides. The more enclosed the shelter, the more effective it will be at retaining body heat. But balance this against the need for concealment. A shelter that is clearly visible from outside is a security risk, and the materials you use for insulation and sidewalls should ideally blend into the surrounding environment rather than standing out from it. Fire in a conflict environment is a profound paradox because it is one of the most powerful tools available for warmth, water purification, food preparation, signaling, and psychological comfort, and it is simultaneously one of the most dangerous things you can produce from a concealment perspective. Fire produces 3 types of signature that can reveal your position: light, smoke, and smell. All 3 are detectable at significant distances. Light from a fire can be seen at night from kilometers away under clear conditions. Smoke from a fire is visible during the day and can be detected from the air by anyone scanning the environment. The smell of wood smoke travels on the wind and can alert people to your presence even when they cannot see you. This means that the decision to build a fire in a field survival situation in an active conflict zone is never a casual one. It is a risk assessment. You weigh the need, warmth in particular, because hypothermia is a genuine killer and a cold night without shelter heating can be immediately life-threatening, against the security risk of producing a visible and detectable signature. When the assessment comes down in favor of fire, and there will be situations where it does because the need is genuine and urgent, the way you build that fire can significantly reduce the signature it produces. The concealed fire pit, sometimes called a Dakota hole or a trench fire, is the most effective technique for reducing the visual and smoke signature of a fire in a field environment. The method involves digging 2 connected holes in the ground. The main hole, roughly 30 centimeters deep and wide enough to hold your fuel, is where the fire burns. A second, smaller hole, connected to the first by a channel at the base, serves as an air intake. The fire in the main pit draws air through the connecting channel, which feeds combustion efficiently and reduces the amount of smoke produced by keeping the fire hot and well supplied with oxygen. The walls of the pit shield the light of the fire from horizontal observation, and the depth of the pit reduces the smoke signature significantly compared to an above-ground fire. Use dry wood wherever possible, because dry wood burns hotter and cleaner and produces dramatically less smoke than damp or green wood. Small diameter wood burns more completely and with less smoke than large logs. And hardwoods, if available, burn cleaner than softwoods. Shield the pit from above using any available cover. Branches arranged over the top, a rock overhang, the slope of a bank, to break up any residual light signature from above. Build your fire in a location that has natural screening from the most likely directions of observation: the side of a hill, inside dense vegetation, in a depression in the ground. Time your fire use for periods of lowest risk. Nighttime fires are more dangerous from a light signature perspective, but may produce less visible smoke. Daytime fires produce more visible smoke, but in some conditions, overcast sky, forested canopy, the smoke may disperse more quickly and be less distinctive. Think about your specific environment and the specific threats you're operating around, and time your fire accordingly. The tools for starting a fire reliably are as important as the techniques for concealing it, because the ability to start a fire quickly on the first or second attempt is what allows you to minimize the time you spend preparing, and thus minimize your overall signature and exposure. Waterproof matches are the most intuitive option and work well in most conditions, but they are finite, and once wet, even waterproof matches can lose reliability. A ferro rod, a magnesium alloy rod that produces a shower of extremely hot sparks when struck with a hard edge, is virtually indestructible, works in wet conditions, has an almost unlimited lifespan relative to matches, and can be used to start a fire in situations where matches would fail. Carry both, keep them in a waterproof container, and know how to use the ferro rod confidently before you need it, because starting a fire with one for the first time in a cold, wet, stressful situation is considerably more difficult than doing it having practiced in calm conditions. Field survival is, at its heart, the art of meeting your fundamental needs with what the natural world and your own preparation provide when the built world and its systems are no longer available to you. It requires knowledge, preparation, and a willingness to be practical and adaptive in conditions that are far from comfortable. None of it is beyond the capability of an ordinary person who has taken the time to learn and practice these skills before they are needed. The concealment techniques in this segment reduce your visibility in an environment where being seen carries genuine risk. The shelter techniques give you protection from the elements when built structures are unavailable. And the fire techniques give you heat, water purification, and food preparation capability while managing the security risks that fire creates in a conflict environment. Together, they form a foundation for survival in the most challenging scenario that conflict can place a civilian in: outside, exposed, and dependent entirely on their own knowledge and the resources of the natural world around them. If you find yourself in that situation, what you now know gives you a genuine fighting chance. In the next segment, we are going to move from the individual and the small group to the broader environment of a conflict-affected community and talk about how people work together, how to interact with aid organizations and official structures, and how the decisions you make about communication and cooperation affect your safety over the longer term. Water, food, and hygiene. There is a way in which the drama of conflict, the explosions, the encounters, the urgent movement through dangerous terrain, can obscure a quieter but equally lethal category of threat. It does not arrive suddenly. It does not make a loud noise. It does not force an immediate decision in the way that a patrol or a sniper or an airstrike does. But it kills just as surely, and in prolonged conflict situations it kills more people than direct violence does. That threat is the slow failure of the basic biological conditions that keep human beings alive. The absence of clean water. The absence of adequate food. The breakdown of hygiene in conditions where disease spreads easily and medical care is unavailable. Across the history of conflict, disease and malnutrition have consistently caused more casualties among civilian populations than weapons have. This is not a historical footnote. It is a pattern that repeats in every major conflict, in every part of the world, across every era. When supply chains break down, when infrastructure fails, when the systems that ordinarily provide clean water and food and sanitation stop functioning, the biological consequences move fast. Dehydration can become life-threatening within days. Malnutrition weakens immune function and makes every other threat more dangerous. Infections that would be trivially treatable in normal circumstances become serious, and then fatal, when there is no medical care available and the body's defenses are already compromised by poor nutrition and physical stress. Understanding how to meet these fundamental needs with limited resources and improvised means is, in an extended conflict situation, as important as any other survival skill. This segment is about exactly that. Water is the most urgent biological need. A human body can survive for weeks without food, but only days without water, and far less in hot conditions or when under physical stress, both of which are common in conflict situations. Finding water and making it safe to drink is therefore the first priority in any field survival situation. In environments where running water from taps is unavailable, natural sources become your primary option. Streams, rivers, and rainwater are the most accessible. But in a conflict zone, natural water sources carry risks that go beyond the ordinary concerns about waterborne pathogens. Water sources near sites of industrial damage, military activity, or chemical contamination may be unsafe in ways that no amount of boiling will remedy. Before you use any natural water source, assess the environment around it. Unusual coloring, oily sheens on the surface, dead vegetation along the banks, or the smell of chemicals are all indicators that the water may be contaminated in ways beyond biological pathogens. If those indicators are present, do not use that source. For biological contamination, which is the most common risk in natural water sources, boiling is the most reliable treatment available without specialized equipment. Bringing water to a rolling boil for at least 1 minute, or 3 minutes at altitude, kills the bacteria, viruses, and parasites responsible for the waterborne diseases that kill people in field conditions. The requirement is fuel, time, and a container, all of which may be in limited supply, which means that conserving clean water once you have it is as important as producing it. In conditions where boiling is not possible, no fire capability, no container, there is a low-technology method for collecting water that requires nothing more than cloth and the natural environment. In the early morning, before the heat of the day evaporates it, plants in many environments are covered in dew. A cloth, a piece of clothing, a rag, any absorbent fabric can be wiped across grass, leaves, and vegetation to absorb that surface moisture, then wrung out into a container. This method produces water slowly and in relatively small quantities, but it is a genuine source of hydration in environments where no other source is available, and dew is typically clean because it has condensed from atmospheric water vapor rather than moving through contaminated ground. It will not sustain a large group, but it can provide meaningful supplemental hydration in a situation where every drop matters. Waste management is a topic that is easy to overlook in discussions of conflict survival because it feels, compared to the urgency of water and food, like a secondary concern. It is not. The improper disposal of human waste in field conditions is one of the most efficient mechanisms for spreading exactly the waterborne diseases, cholera, typhoid, dysentery, that kill people in prolonged conflict situations. When waste contaminates water sources or is deposited in areas where flies can access it and then contact food, the transmission pathway for these diseases becomes very short and very efficient. The solution is straightforward and low technology. Before you use the open ground as a latrine, dig a hole. Not a large hole, 6 inches deep and roughly the same in diameter is sufficient. Use it, then cover it completely with the excavated soil, tamping it down to seal the surface. This simple act, the cat hole method, used by militaries and wilderness travelers around the world, buries waste below the surface layer where fly access is minimal and biological breakdown processes work most effectively. It keeps the surface environment clean, reduces the transmission pathway for disease, and protects both your group and any water sources in the vicinity. Establish a designated latrine area at a consistent distance and direction from your shelter, downhill from any water source, downwind from your living area, far enough from your shelter to maintain hygiene separation but close enough to be accessible safely. Consistency in where waste is disposed of is as important as the disposal method itself. Food in a field survival situation presents a different kind of challenge from water because the timeline is longer and the options are more varied. But the underlying principle is the same. You need to know how to meet this need with what is available in your environment, and you need to do it in ways that minimize the risk of making yourself sick in circumstances where illness is particularly dangerous. When you have access to protein, meat, or fish obtained by any available means, preserving it without refrigeration is a critical skill because protein spoils quickly in warm conditions, and spoiled protein causes the kind of gastrointestinal illness that, in a field environment without medical care, can be severely debilitating. Drying is the oldest and most reliable method of meat preservation available without modern technology, and smoke drying is the most effective form of drying available in a field setting. The process involves cutting meat or fish into thin strips, thin enough that moisture can escape from the interior before the surface dries and traps it, which means strips no thicker than about 1 centimeter, and exposing them to continuous low heat and smoke over an extended period, typically several hours to a full day depending on the thickness of the strips and the ambient humidity. The smoke contributes more than just heat to the preservation process. Wood smoke contains antimicrobial compounds that inhibit the growth of bacteria on the surface of the meat, which extends its safe storage life significantly beyond what drying alone would achieve. Properly smoked and dried jerky, meat that is genuinely dry throughout, not just on the surface, with no remaining moisture when squeezed, can be stored without refrigeration for days to weeks depending on conditions. Use low, consistent heat rather than high heat, which cooks the exterior while leaving moisture trapped inside. Hardwoods produce cleaner smoke with more effective antimicrobial properties than softwoods. Keep the meat elevated above the heat source in the smoke flow rather than in direct flame, and turn it periodically to ensure even drying on all surfaces. For any food stores that are in sealed containers, canned goods, sealed packaged food, anything with an intact seal. Extending their shelf life in warm field conditions can be achieved by burying them. Soil temperature a foot or more below the surface is significantly and consistently cooler than air temperature, particularly in warmer climates, and this cooler environment slows the spoilage processes that heat accelerates. Dig a cache in a shaded location. Barrier-sealed containers wrapped in any available waterproof material to protect the seals from ground moisture. Mark the location carefully so you can find it again, and you have a simple, functional field refrigerator that requires no power and no maintenance. Beyond preserved or stored food, the natural environment itself contains nutrition that is accessible to anyone who knows what to look for. Plant foraging is a skill that comes with a genuine caveat. The wrong plant can make you seriously ill or kill you, and in a situation where you cannot afford to be sick, confident identification is essential before you eat anything foraged. Do not forage and eat anything you cannot positively identify. When in doubt, do not eat it. With that caveat firmly in place, there are plants that are so widely distributed, so visually distinctive, and so thoroughly non-toxic that they are worth knowing specifically as reliable, identifiable food sources. Dandelions are one of the most practically valuable edible wild plants available in temperate environments. Every part of the plant is edible. The leaves, which are most palatable when young and before the plant flowers, can be eaten raw or cooked and provide genuine nutritional value, including vitamins A and C. The flowers are edible. The roots can be roasted and used as a coffee substitute. The plant is so visually distinctive. The serrated leaves, the hollow stem, the familiar yellow flower and spherical seed head, that misidentification is virtually impossible for anyone who has seen a dandelion before, which is most people. In many conflict-affected environments in temperate zones, dandelions will be present in abandoned lots, gardens, and open ground and represent a reliable, zero-cost nutritional supplement. Cattails, the tall, distinctive reed plants with their characteristic brown cylindrical seed heads, are one of the most nutritionally dense edible wild plants in wetland environments and are present across an enormous geographic range. The young shoots at the base of the plant, below water level, can be peeled and eaten raw or cooked and have a flavor similar to cucumber. The pollen from the male flower head, produced in early summer, can be collected in large quantities and used as a flower supplement. The starchy roots are edible year-round and can be processed to extract a usable starch for cooking. Like the dandelion, the cattail is visually unmistakable once you know what it looks like, which makes it one of the most safely forageable plants available. These are starting points, not a complete guide to wild foraging. If you have the opportunity before any conflict situation develops in your area, investing time in learning the specific edible plants of your local environment, taking a foraging course, studying a field guide specific to your region, will give you a much richer and more immediately applicable skill set than any general overview can provide. Hygiene in field conditions is the final pillar of this segment, and it deserves the same seriousness as water and food, because the failure of hygiene in extended field conditions produces the same outcome: illness, debilitation, and in severe cases death, through mechanisms that are just as real even if they are less immediately dramatic. The most common hygiene-related health problems in field conflict situations are skin infections, insect-borne disease, and the lice and other parasitic infestations that spread rapidly in conditions of crowding and limited washing. Each of these can be managed with techniques that require minimal resources. Lice, body lice in particular, are a consistent problem in field conditions where clothing cannot be regularly washed and changed, and where people are living in close proximity. Body lice live in clothing rather than on the body itself, moving onto skin only to feed, and their presence in clothing is both the mechanism of their persistence and the mechanism of their control. Boiling clothing in water for a sustained period, maintaining a rolling boil for at least 10 minutes, kills lice at all stages of their life cycle, including eggs, which are more heat-resistant than adult lice. This is not laundry in any comfortable sense. It requires fuel, a container, and water. But in field conditions where lice infestation is present or threatened, it is the most effective control measure available without chemical treatments, and lice are worth taking seriously because beyond the discomfort they are vectors for serious diseases, including typhus. Skin integrity. Keeping the skin intact and free of breaks, cracks, and open wounds is a hygiene priority that people rarely think about but that matters significantly in field conditions. Hands, in particular, develop cracks from repeated wetting and drying from cold, from physical work, and from the absence of the moisturizing products that most people use without thinking in ordinary life. These cracks, however small, are entry points for bacteria in an environment where hands are in constant contact with soil, wood, water, and other surfaces that carry significant bacterial loads. An infected crack in a knuckle, trivially treatable with antibiotics in normal life, can become seriously problematic when antibiotics are unavailable and the immune system is already compromised by stress, cold, and poor nutrition. Petroleum jelly, Vaseline or its generic equivalent, applied to cracked or chapped skin seals those micro-openings against bacterial entry, provides a moisture barrier that slows further cracking and promotes the healing of existing breaks. It requires almost no quantity to be effective, it has an essentially unlimited shelf life, and it takes up minimal space in a kit. Keep a small container in your emergency supplies specifically for this purpose, and use it as a preventive measure on hands and any other areas of skin that are showing signs of dryness or cracking, rather than waiting until cracks have already become infected. More broadly, prioritize hand hygiene above all other hygiene practices in field conditions, because hands are the primary transmission pathway for the gastrointestinal illnesses that spread most easily in these situations. Wash hands with whatever soap and water are available before handling food and after any latrine use. If soap is unavailable, ash from a wood fire has mild antimicrobial properties and can serve as a rudimentary cleaning agent. Hand sanitizer in your kit should be conserved for these highest priority moments rather than used casually. The needs addressed in this segment, water, food, waste management, and hygiene, are the needs that determine whether a person survives a conflict situation measured in weeks and months rather than hours and days. They are not the dramatic, acute needs that dominate the imagination when people think about war. But they are, in the longer arc of any conflict, the needs that most consistently determine outcomes for civilian populations. The knowledge in this segment can be studied, practiced, and built on before any emergency. Foraging plants can be identified and sampled. Water collection methods can be tested. Fire-starting tools can be practiced with. Shelter-building techniques can be tried in low-stakes conditions. Every hour you invest in building practical familiarity with these skills before you need them is an hour that pays enormous dividends in the quality of your decision-making and the steadiness of your hands when the situation is real. In the final segment, we're going to bring everything together, looking at the longer-term psychological and community dimensions of surviving conflict and leaving you with a framework for thinking about your own situation that you can carry forward from this video into your own preparation. Medical improvisation. Of all the skills in this video, the ones in this segment carry perhaps the heaviest emotional weight. Because we are not talking about preparation you do in advance, or decisions you make about routes and supplies and timing. We are talking about what you do when someone in front of you is hurt. When a person you care about or a stranger who needs help has a wound, a fracture, an injury that in ordinary life would have them in an ambulance and in an emergency room within minutes. And in this situation, those options do not exist. There is no ambulance coming. The hospital may be inaccessible, damaged, or overwhelmed. You are what is available. Your hands, your knowledge, and whatever materials you can find or improvise are the medical system in this moment. That is an enormous weight to carry, and it is worth acknowledging that directly rather than glossing over it. The gap between what you can do with improvised materials and what a trained medical professional can do in a fully equipped facility is real, and it is large. There are injuries that cannot be managed in the field, and knowing the limits of what is possible is as important as knowing the techniques themselves. But within those limits, the difference between someone who has knowledge and someone who does not is also real and also large. People survive injuries in field conditions because someone nearby knew what to do. People die from injuries that were survivable because nobody did. The knowledge in this segment sits on that fault line, and taking it seriously, learning it, thinking through it, practicing what can be practiced, is one of the most concrete acts of preparation you can make. Let us begin with wounds, because wound management is the most immediately time-critical medical skill in a conflict environment. Uncontrolled bleeding is the leading cause of preventable death from traumatic injury, and it is also the area where timely, correct action by a non-medical person can most dramatically change the outcome. The first and most important response to any significant wound is direct pressure. Firm, sustained, uninterrupted pressure applied directly to the wound is the foundational intervention for controlling bleeding, and it works because it supports the body's own clotting mechanism by holding blood in contact with the wound site and reducing blood flow, while the clotting factors in blood do their work. Press hard, with whatever clean material you have available. Ideally sterile gauze from your first aid kit, but in the field, any clean cloth, and do not remove it to check the wound. If blood soaks through, add more material on top rather than removing what is already in place, because removing it disrupts the clot that is beginning to form. Maintain pressure for a minimum of 10 minutes by the clock before assessing whether bleeding has slowed. Once a wound has been stabilized and bleeding controlled, the question of closure arises. Small, superficial cuts will often close adequately with careful approximation of the wound edges and improvised closure strips, thin pieces of tape or clean cloth used like the butterfly strips that a medical professional would use. These are appropriate for small, clean cuts with edges that come together neatly without tension. Deeper or longer wounds that will not stay closed with surface approximation present a more challenging situation. In a field environment where professional medical care is not available, a wound that remains open is a wound that is continuously at risk of contamination and infection in field conditions without antibiotics is a serious and potentially fatal complication. Closure, in those circumstances, becomes a genuine survival consideration even though the methods available are far from the sterile, precise techniques of a surgical environment. If closure is genuinely necessary, the wound is significant, it will not stay closed by other means, and professional care is not available or reachable within a timeframe that makes waiting a reasonable option, then suturing with a sterilized needle and dental floss represents the improvised technique that most closely approximates what a medical professional would do. The preparation of the materials matters enormously. The needle needs to be as sterile as you can make it. Pass it through a flame until the metal glows, then allow it to cool before use. Do not wipe it on anything after sterilizing. Dental floss, preferably unwaxed, is strong, does not degrade quickly in tissue, and is thin enough to pass through a needle eye. It is not surgical suture material, and this matters. It is thicker than suture thread. It does not have the same tissue compatibility, and it is more likely to cause localized irritation. But it is what is available, and in the context of preventing an open wound from becoming a severe infection, its limitations are acceptable against the alternative. Flush the wound thoroughly before any attempt at closure. If you have clean water and nothing else, use it copiously to wash out debris and surface contamination. If you have antiseptic, use it. The interior of the wound needs to be as clean as you can make it before you close it, because closing a contaminated wound traps contamination inside and creates exactly the conditions in which infection develops most rapidly. The suturing technique for a simple wound closure is a series of interrupted stitches, individual stitches placed along the length of the wound rather than one continuous thread, so that if one stitch fails or becomes infected, the others remain intact. Each stitch passes through the skin on one side of the wound, crosses the wound, and passes back through the skin on the other side, with the two ends tied together with enough tension to bring the wound edges into contact without cutting into the skin. Space the stitches evenly, roughly a centimeter apart. Tie the knots firmly, but not so tightly that they cut into the tissue. You are bringing the edges together, not compressing them. After closure, cover the wound with the cleanest dressing you have and monitor it closely for signs of infection, increasing redness, swelling, warmth, pus, or the development of red streaks extending from the wound site, which indicate a spreading infection that is a medical emergency requiring the most urgent effort to reach professional care. If any of these signs develop, reopen the wound and allow it to drain rather than remaining closed over an infection. It needs to be said clearly. Suturing a wound without training, without proper instruments, and without sterile conditions is a last resort. If there is any possibility of reaching medical care within a time frame that makes it a viable option, pursue that option rather than attempting closure in the field. The technique described here is for situations where that option does not exist, and the alternative to improvised closure is leaving a significant wound open indefinitely in field conditions. Fractures and sprains represent a different category of injury, less immediately life-threatening in most cases than severe bleeding, but capable of causing lasting damage and of severely compromising a person's ability to move and function in exactly the situations where mobility may be critical to survival. The distinction between a fracture and a sprain is important to establish as accurately as possible because the management differs and the implications for movement differ. Both will cause pain, swelling, and bruising in the area of injury. A fracture, a break in the bone, will typically cause pain that is precisely located at a specific point along the bone, severe enough that weight-bearing or use of the limb is impossible or extremely limited, and may involve visible deformity if the break is displaced. A sprain, damage to the ligaments around a joint, typically causes diffuse pain around the joint itself, swelling concentrated around the joint, and may allow some limited use of the limb even though it is painful. If you press along the length of a bone, and there is a specific point of intense, focal pain, treat it as a fracture regardless of whether deformity is visible. For both fractures and severe sprains, the foundational treatment principle is immobilization of the injured area. Movement of a fracture causes pain, can cause additional tissue damage, and in the case of fractures involving certain bones, the femur, the pelvis, the spine, can cause or worsen internal bleeding that is itself life-threatening. Preventing movement of the injured area is the most important thing you can do in the field for either of these injuries. Immobilization is achieved through splinting, placing rigid supports on either side of the injured area and securing them in place to prevent movement. In a well-stocked medical environment, a splint is a purpose-designed rigid device. In a field environment, it is whatever rigid material is available and can be fashioned into a straight support of the right length. Straight sticks are the most immediately available option in most environments where field survival is relevant, and they work effectively when used correctly. The principle of splinting is to immobilize the joint above and the joint below the injury, not just the injury itself. If the injury is to the forearm, for example, the splint needs to extend from above the elbow to below the wrist, immobilizing both the elbow and the wrist so that the bones of the forearm cannot rotate or flex. If the injury is to the lower leg, the splint needs to extend from above the knee to below the ankle. Gather 2 or more straight sticks or other rigid materials, straight branches, sections of firm plastic, anything that will not bend under the load of the limb, of sufficient length to span the required distance. Place them on either side of the injured limb, with padding between the stick and the skin wherever possible, clothing, leaves, anything soft, to prevent pressure sores and reduce discomfort. Secure them firmly in place with strips of cloth, lengths of cord, or any available binding material, tied at several points along the length of the splint. The binding needs to be firm enough to prevent movement, but not so tight that it restricts circulation. Check periodically that fingers or toes beyond the end of the splint are still warm and have feeling, as these are the indicators that circulation is intact. For lower limb injuries, elevation of the injured limb is an important adjunct to splinting. Raising the limb above the level of the heart reduces swelling by using gravity to assist venous drainage from the injured area. In a field environment, this means propping the splinted limb on whatever is available: a rolled sleeping bag, a folded piece of clothing, a carefully arranged pile of vegetation, to keep it elevated when the person is at rest. Elevation is most effective in the first hours after an injury, when swelling is most active, but it remains beneficial throughout the initial treatment period. A person with a splinted lower limb injury may be unable to walk without assistance, or may be unable to walk at all, and this has significant implications for any subsequent movement that the group needs to make. If evacuation is necessary, think through in advance how a non-ambulatory person will be moved. An improvised stretcher, 2 poles or strong branches threaded through the sleeves of 2 jackets, or a tarpaulin folded around 2 poles, can carry a person over terrain that a makeshift wheelchair or dragon cannot. This is a physically demanding task that requires at least 2 people and ideally more, and it needs to be organized rather than improvised in a panic. There is a broader principle that underlies everything in this segment, and it is worth making explicit before we close. That principle is this: In a conflict environment without reliable access to medical care, your goal is not to replace professional medicine. It is to stabilize, to prevent deterioration, and to buy time. Time for the situation to change. Time for access to professional care to become possible. Time for the body's own extraordinary healing capabilities to begin working. Controlling bleeding buys time. Closing a wound prevents the infection that would otherwise develop over days or weeks. Splinting an injury prevents the additional damage that uncontrolled movement would cause and preserves the possibility of function once care is available. Elevating a swollen limb slows the swelling that would otherwise compromise circulation and healing. None of these interventions are the final treatment. They are the bridge to the final treatment. And building that bridge, keeping a person stable, keeping them alive, preventing their condition from deteriorating to the point of no return, is something that a non-medical person with knowledge can genuinely do. It is something that saves lives. It is something that is worth knowing with the same seriousness and commitment that you bring to every other element of the preparation we have discussed in this video. Learn basic first aid from a qualified instructor if you can. Take a wilderness first aid or combat casualty care course if one is available to you. These courses specifically address the scenarios where professional care is not immediately available and are designed for exactly the circumstances we have been discussing. The knowledge in this segment is a foundation, not a ceiling, and building on it before any emergency arrives is one of the highest value investments in survival preparation you can make. In the final segment, we're going to step back from the specific techniques and talk about the longer view, the psychological dimension of surviving conflict over time, the importance of community, and how to think about recovery and resilience in the aftermath of everything that conflict puts people through. Mental survival. We have covered a great deal of ground in this video. We have talked about preparation and planning, about movement and navigation, about shelter and fire and food and water and medical improvisation. We have worked through the specific, practical, physical techniques that give a person the best available chance of surviving the most dangerous scenarios that conflict can produce. And all of that knowledge matters. All of it is real and useful and worth carrying. But there is something that runs underneath all of it, something that makes the difference between a person who can access and apply that knowledge under pressure and a person who cannot. It is not equipment. It is not physical fitness. It is not even experience, though experience helps. It is the state of the mind that is doing the thinking, making the decisions, sustaining the effort, and holding the people around it together when everything is difficult and frightening and exhausting. The mind is the instrument through which every other survival skill is accessed and applied. And the mind, under the sustained stress of conflict, is itself a system that can be damaged, overwhelmed, and broken down, or, with the right understanding and the right practices, maintained, protected, and kept functional enough to do the work that survival requires. This is the final segment of the video, and it is in some ways the most important. Because you can have the best emergency kit in the world, the best family plan, the most detailed map, and the most comprehensive knowledge of field survival techniques, and if your mind has been broken down by fear, by trauma, by sleeplessness, by the grinding psychological weight of sustained danger, none of that knowledge will save you. The psychological dimension of survival is not a soft afterthought to the practical material. It is the foundation on which everything else rests. Let us start with the most acute end of the psychological spectrum, the moments of overwhelming anxiety and panic that conflict situations regularly produce. Panic is not weakness. It is a biological response to extreme threat, mediated by the autonomic nervous system, and it evolved because in certain circumstances it is adaptive. It floods the body with the resources needed for immediate physical action. But in a conflict survival context, uncontrolled panic is dangerous. It impairs judgment. It drives impulsive action. It narrows attention to the point where critical information is missed and options are not seen. And it is contagious in ways that compound its effects across a group. The ability to interrupt a panic response, to bring yourself back from the edge of overwhelm and into a state where your higher cognitive functions are accessible again, is therefore a practical survival skill, not just a wellness practice. And the techniques for doing it are grounded in the physiology of the stress response in ways that make them reliably effective when applied correctly. The first technique is controlled breathing. The autonomic nervous system, which drives the panic response, has two branches: the sympathetic, which produces activation and alarm, and the parasympathetic, which produces calm and recovery. Breathing is one of the very few physiological functions that crosses both systems, meaning that voluntary control of breathing can directly influence the balance between them. Deliberately slowing and regulating the breath activates the parasympathetic branch and begins to counteract the sympathetic activation of the panic response. The specific pattern that is most consistently effective involves equal phases of inhalation, retention, and exhalation. Breathe in for a count of 4, hold for a count of 4, breathe out for a count of 4. This pattern is sometimes called box breathing, and it has been adopted by military special operations units, emergency responders, and trauma therapists around the world precisely because it works reliably under extreme stress conditions and requires no equipment, no training beyond a brief introduction, and no particular physical capability. Anyone can do it anywhere, including in a dark shelter during an active attack. The count gives the mind something specific to focus on, which itself interrupts the ruminative spiral of anxious thought. The regulated breath directly modulates the physiological response, and the combination of the two produces a measurable return toward functional calm within minutes, even in very high-stress conditions. Practice this before you need it. The physiological pathway it works through is strengthened by repetition, and a person who has used this technique regularly in ordinary life will find it more accessible and more effective under extreme pressure than someone encountering it for the first time in a crisis. Alongside controlled breathing, the practice of grounding is one of the most effective tools for managing acute anxiety and dissociative responses in conflict situations. Grounding works by redirecting attention from the internal experience of anxiety, the racing thoughts, the catastrophic projections, the overwhelming sense of threat, to concrete, sensory, present-moment experience. It interrupts the cognitive loop of anxious thought by anchoring awareness in what is actually physically present right now, in this moment, in this body, in this immediate environment. The most widely used grounding technique is the sequential sensory inventory, and it goes like this. Identify 5 things you can see. Name them deliberately, either out loud or in your mind, not just registering them in passing, but actually attending to them, describing them to yourself. Then identify 4 things you can physically touch. Reach out and make actual physical contact with them, noticing the texture, temperature, and resistance of each one. Then 3 things you can hear, 2 things you can smell, and 1 thing you can taste. What this technique does, neurologically, is activate the sensory processing networks of the brain, which compete with the anxiety and threat processing networks for cognitive resources. The more fully your attention is engaged with concrete sensory experience, the less bandwidth is available for the ruminative, catastrophic thinking that sustains the anxiety response. It does not eliminate the underlying situation or the underlying threat, but it restores a degree of present-moment functioning that allows you to think, decide, and act rather than being paralyzed or driven by panic. This technique is also one that can be taught to children and used with them in real time during frightening situations. Walking a frightened child through the sequential sensory inventory, what can you see, what can you touch, what can you hear, gives them something concrete to do with their attention in a moment of fear, and the process of guiding them through it can also serve as a grounding exercise for the adult doing the guiding. Acute panic and overwhelming anxiety are the sharp end of the psychological challenge in conflict. But the more common and in many ways more damaging psychological reality of extended conflict is the grinding, sustained stress of living under threat over days, weeks, and months. The chronic hypervigilance, the sleeplessness, the erosion of hope, the slow wearing down of a person's capacity to function, to plan, to care for others, to maintain the ordinary human connections that give life meaning even in terrible circumstances. This is where daily routine becomes a survival tool. Routine imposes structure on chaos, and structure is psychologically protective in ways that go beyond simple comfort. When the external environment is unpredictable and uncontrollable, which is the defining feature of a conflict situation, the maintenance of internal structure, of predictable daily patterns that you choose and control, provides a counterweight to that external chaos. It signals to the nervous system that not everything is chaos, that some things remain within your agency, that the day has a shape even if that shape is nothing like what life used to look like. The specific content of the routine matters less than its consistency and its human normalcy. Mealtimes that happen at predictable times of day, even if the food is simple and limited, impose a rhythm that the body and mind anchor to. Some form of physical movement each day, even just walking back and forth in a confined space, even just stretching, maintains the physiological benefits of exercise, which include the regulation of stress hormones and the improvement of sleep quality, both of which are critical for sustained psychological function. Small rituals, a particular way of beginning the morning, a specific activity that marks the end of the day, provide markers that divide time into manageable units rather than allowing it to stretch into a continuous, undifferentiated experience of threat. For children especially, routine is profoundly stabilizing. Children's sense of security is heavily tied to predictability, to the expectation that the day will unfold in a recognizable pattern, that adults around them are following a plan, that the world has order even if it is frightening. Maintaining whatever elements of normal routine are possible, regular meals, a bedtime ritual, some form of activity or learning during the day, actively supports children's psychological resilience in conflict conditions in ways that have been consistently documented in the research on children and war. Human beings are not designed for isolation. We are a deeply social species, and the psychological research on what sustains people through extreme adversity consistently points to connection with others as one of the most powerful protective factors available. Not the presence of others in a purely physical sense. Being in a crowded shelter does not protect mental health if the connections within it are absent, but genuine human connection. Being known. Being cared about. Caring about others. The mutual recognition that you are not alone in what you are facing. In a conflict situation, maintaining connection with family and friends is worth genuine effort and real risk assessment. A voice call, hearing the actual voice of someone you love, someone who knows you and is thinking about you, has measurable psychological effects that a text message does not replicate. When voice communication is possible, prioritize it over text. When it is not possible, maintain it in whatever form is available. A message that says, "I am here, I am safe, I am thinking of you," sent and received, does real psychological work for both the sender and the recipient. Beyond the immediate circle of family and friends, the broader community around you is both a resource and a responsibility. Communities that come through conflict with their social fabric intact are more resilient, more capable of collective problem-solving, and better able to support the most vulnerable among them than communities that have fragmented into isolated, mutually suspicious individuals. And the way that social fabric is maintained and strengthened in exactly the conditions that threaten it is through the simple, repeated act of people helping each other. Helping a neighbor, sharing information, contributing to a collective task, checking on someone who is alone, offering a skill or a resource that someone else needs, does something that goes beyond the immediate practical benefit. It reaffirms membership in a community. It creates the experience of mattering to someone and of someone mattering to you. It produces the sense of agency and purpose that is one of the most potent protections against the psychological collapse that sustained helplessness induces. In helping others, you are not just helping them. You are actively maintaining your own psychological health and the health of the social environment that everyone in your community depends on. Look for these opportunities deliberately. They are present in every conflict situation, even the most severe, because human need is continuous and human capacity, however constrained, is never zero. What can you offer? What do you know that someone else needs to know? What can you do that someone near you cannot? The answers to those questions are the currency of community resilience, and spending them generously is one of the most effective things you can do for yourself and for the people around you. Sleep is not a luxury in a conflict situation. It is a biological necessity whose absence degrades every other capability you have: physical endurance, cognitive function, emotional regulation, immune function, decision-making quality, in ways that compound rapidly over time. A person who has not slept adequately for several days is not simply tired. They are cognitively impaired in ways that are comparable to significant alcohol intoxication. Their judgment is compromised. Their reaction time is extended. Their emotional responses are dysregulated. Their ability to learn, to plan, to remember, and to assess risk is measurably and significantly reduced. In a conflict environment, where judgment and reaction time and the ability to assess risk can be the difference between life and death, allowing sleep deprivation to accumulate to severe levels is a genuine survival threat. Protecting sleep, creating the conditions for it, prioritizing it, organizing group schedules so that everyone gets adequate rest rather than everyone staying vigilant all night, is a practical survival strategy, not an indulgence. Create whatever conditions support sleep in your environment. Darkness, warmth, physical safety, and the absence of excessive noise are the primary factors, and while conflict often makes all of these harder to achieve, they are worth actively working toward. Rotating watch duties within a group so that individuals can sleep for extended, uninterrupted periods is more effective than everyone maintaining a half-awake vigilance through the night. The physiological restoration of sleep happens primarily in the later cycles of a full sleep period, and frequent interruptions prevent those restorative cycles from completing even if the total time spent lying down is adequate.